Gale had thoroughly lost himself in rage. The thought of having lost to a mortal was one thing, but the fact that it had been so easy and casual, even when he tipped the balances in his favor, was a humiliation his martial way could not withstand. If at the start of all of this Gale's inner devil was fabricated, it was entirely real now. His arrogance crumbled in a mere instant, leaving behind a seething and boiling animosity he did not have anywhere to place. It bubbled over, causing his eyes to redden with a light of madness. A wave of spiritual chi erupted along with his aura, pervading the ceremonial hall. Many weaker individuals immediately fainted, unable to handle the assault on their mental realm. At this moment, Ryu was in a trance, a flood of information overwhelming him. A dull ache started slowly, before growing outward. His heavenly pupils seemed primed to evolve, but he simply did not have the cultivation to sustain such a change. In the end, he hit an insurmountable barrier. The origin flame knew that if this bottleneck was forcefully shattered, Ryu's only path would be death. It was in that instant that a wave of spiritual chi raged toward Ryu. No matter how talented he was still immortal. Ryu's mental realm was mature, but his spiritual chi was far too weak because he did not have the realm to sustain it. If Gale's wave of rage hit him in such a vulnerable state, Ryu's only path would once more be death. What Gale was doing was absolutely reckless. Putting aside the fact Ryu's death would cause irreconcilable hatred between the Ventus and Tatsuya clans, the mere fact he was using his spiritual chi to attack without form was practically suicidal. One's spiritual chi was the most fragile part of one's body. It could only be transformed into a weapon for attack if coupled with mental realm techniques, but such techniques were all destroyed. However, how could Gale care about such a thing? Spiritual chi was undoubtedly the fastest attack in existence. If he attacked normally, Ryu's family would have far too much time to react. After all, although Gale was talented, he was still a member of the younger generation. Plus, did not it also help him that no one would expect him to do something so stupid? This was not all either. Ryu was nothing but a mortal. Even if he had not been in a trance-like state, it was impossible for him to do any real damage to Gale. Even his ability to defend his own self would be nothing but a fleeting dream. In Gale's mind, Ryu was dead without a doubt. The closest individual, and the one most capable of stopping Gale's actions, was old mistress Holy Wing. In fact, this old mistress was just a single step behind Gale, and had been from start to finish. If she wanted to, she could simply reach out and touch his back. With her cultivation, stopping him would be as easy as thinking it. But would she do such a thing? Old Mistress Holy Wing's eyes flashed with a light of hesitation before becoming decisive. She pretended not to notice anything wrong, despite the fact she was the closest. After the deed was done, even if Titus and Himari wanted to declare war on the Holy Wing clan and the Ventus clan, would their various priests, grand priests and supreme priests, allow it? Especially for a dead cripple. She sneered when she thought to this point. In fact, Gale's thought process was not too different. Would they dare? The Golden Era had been far too peaceful. The last war was several trillion years ago. Their people had long since forgotten what it meant to struggle, what it meant to live with their lives on the line. Would the people of the Shrine Plain, who had grown accustomed to comfort, sit idly by as the Tatsuya clan waged war for a cripple? The public outrage would cause a severe drop in their faith. Your life is worth nothing. Die, Gale roared in his mind. However, in all the sinister and vile schemes Gale and old Mistress Holy Wing concocted, they had both forgotten one very important thing. From birth, she had always been by Ryu's side. She was there when Ryu was a bright-eyed little boy, with a smile that could light the world. She was there when the smile faded into an unending coldness, the day his Meridian Awakening ceremony failed. She was there when Ryu entered the shrine library with the determination of an unrivaled expert, and she was there when he exited with the knowledge of one. She was there when Ryu conquered his first ruin, saved his first extinct species, cracked his first formation, even when he fell in love for the first time. She was there for all of these things, so how could she not be here now? a supreme beauty stepped out from the void, appearing before Ryu as though she was nothing but a wisp of heavenly fragrance. Her hair was as black as the night, falling to the small of her back like a calm and steady waterfall. Everything from the gentle slope of her small nose, to the delicate lining of her soft cherry lips, to the shapely contours of her holy body, caused the eyes of those who landed on her to shiver. Still, their thoughts remained pure. Even the most perverted, unscrupulous individual would not be able to scrounge up a single obscene thought when looking at this beauty. She was simply an angel, impossible to blaspheme on penalty of death. However, at this moment, this otherworldly beauty's soft features were contorted in anger. How dare these vile individuals attack her Ryu? Her heart would not be able to rest unless they were both dead. Nura's sky-blue gown fluttered as her aura rose, her face, even contorted and reddened with anger, the epitome of beauty itself. A small grunt of rage escaped her perfect lips, unleashing a torrent of Kai Gale was no match for. Caught completely unawares, Gale had not even registered Nura's appearance before his spiritual chi was sliced apart with vicious abandon. His face paled, blood flowing from his lips as he collapsed to his knees. His vision blurred, causing him to only be capable of seeing the faint image of the beauty before him. In his eyes, she looked no different from the god of death. Silence completely covered the ceremonial hall. The gravity of the situation was clear to anyone with half a mind to realize just what had just happened. Although an attack of spiritual chi was the fastest in all of existence, it also had very clear and obvious markers when so unrestrained. Everyone realized exactly what happened the moment Nura's figure came fully into view. While some were stunned that Ryu had such a beautiful death guard, others were far more worried about exactly what the fallout of this situation would be. And maybe exactly due to the gravity of the situation, they did not need to wait very long for an answer. Alina paled with rage, immediately stepping to Nura's side to protect Ryu to her back. However, she did not even get the chance to attack Gale in her rage because the Tatsuya clan heavenly couple had completely lost their minds at the thought of how close they had come to losing their son. Today would be the day the Shrine Plain learned that as domineering as priest Saint Tatsuya was, Himari Tatsuya was even more so. A flash of blue and red erupted with a rage that shook Tatsuya Palace. Minerals the likes of which were rare even in their society shattered to mere particles of dust. The sky quaked, and the earth splintered as though the heavens were personifying their anger. "Please have mercy." Priest St. Ventus stood quickly. With how the situation had devolved, he had no choice but to act like this. His grandson had truly brought shame to their family. He had not only lost to a mortal, but he even refused to accept it even in the face of so many witnesses. Then he had the audacity to attempt to murder the heir of the Tatsuya clan before not only his parents, but his grandparents as well. Priest St. Ventus was filled with infinite regrets. If only he had known, he would not have spoiled his grandson so much. He would have refined his mental realm more. He would have cultivated his martial way to a greater extent. But it was all too late, much too late. Gale could only watch as two palms, one fierce and tyrannical, the other gentle and deadly, collided with his head. Despair colored his foggy eyes. Would he really die like this? To die at the hands of the number 1 and 2 expert of the Shrine Plain was a sort of honor, was it not? So why did he feel so bitter? There was no suspense in the matter. Although Gale's death guard too stepped forward, his body was obliterated along with his young master. Maybe this poor old man's silver lining was that, unlike Gale, he could take appropriate pride in the hands by which he died. No, Priest St. Ventus' chest convulsed, pulsing with rage and sorrow. Blood infused with his anger flew from his lips, coating his green robes. If it was not for the members of the Ventus clan catching his falling body, he would have graced the ground. Veilska, 2 roars pierced through the heavens. Titus' red robes fluttered with his rage, his fiery hair projecting backward akin to the backdrop of a bloodthirsty demon. Flames the likes of which rarely appeared in the world erupted along his valiant figure, bathing the ceremonial hall in a heat so profound that the ground beneath him burnt to ash. It was clear that if it was not for Nura's protection, Even Ryo himself would have died to his father's rage. Himari stood directly to her husband's side, her white gown making her the picture of a heavenly goddess. Sparks of blue lightning shattered the tiles beneath her feet, even as a blue flame enshrouded her seemingly delicate body. Her blue eyes shook with a piercing cold, staring daggers at the old mistress before her. A beautiful array of blues and reds swirled around the angered heavenly couple. To dare to attempt to lay hands on their son right before them. Were these fools tired of living, who here did not understand the meaning behind old mistress' holy wings in action? Did she take them for children who did not know the ways of the world? Or did she think that she was so far above reproach that her actions did not matter? Old Mistress Holy Wing wanted to sneer and make a snide comment about how she had no obligation to protect their son for them, but she never got that opportunity. Himari and Titus cared little for her explanations and wanted to hear her petty words even less. Ryu might have entertained her nonsense, but that was only because his fists were not large enough to teach her a lesson. However, did they have such an issue? Of course not. Above Himari's fluttering white hair, the call of a phoenix and the roar of a kiln sounded. In the next moment, a beautiful heavenly bird covered in sapphire flames appeared right beside a sturdy four-legged creature with a majestic aura and shining blue, gem-like scales. To her side, Titus evoked the same call, allowing an untouchable heavenly bird covered in ruby-like flames to appear. However, the roar that coupled it was far more domineering. The presence of the sovereign dragon overwhelmed the ceremonial halls, appearing with it a crimson-scaled emperor of the skies. Old Mistress Holy Wing's pink diamond eyes widened before constricting to the size of mere pinholes. Had the Tatsuya heavenly couple really improved this much? It was impossible. She was a member of the oldest generation. She had reigned supreme for billions of years. She should not be feeling so suppressed. A roar escaped her lips as she tried to shake herself of this feeling. She pulled her short sword from her hip, taking a step forward to meet this couple head-on. A collision the likes of which rarely seen in the shrine plain eviscerated the palace hall. A cacophonic eruption of earth-shattering noise and destruction blew out in every direction. Directly behind it, a wave of blue, red, and white plumes of flames shot into the sky, finally destroying the oppressed ceiling of Tatsuya Palace. By the time the smoke settled, the only thing that remained was a devastated ceremonial hall and a scene that shocked those of every generation. To one side, a heavenly couple stood shoulder to shoulder, the 10-meter radius around them completely unaffected, protected by their valiant auras. However, to the other, a once gallant woman of the oldest generation lay. Veilska lay on the ground sprawled, her life and death unknown as fresh blood flowed from her depressed chest. The events of the Tatsuya clan heir's birthday shook the shrine plain. The death of a young genius and leader of the youthful generation, his loss to a mere mortal, and the fatal injury to an old mistress of the oldest generation. Even alone, these pieces of news would cause an uproar, but together, it was enough to light the world on fire. There were other shocking revelations, even beyond this as well. The first was the news of the battle prowess of the so-called heavenly couple. One had to know that when Titus and Himari were betrothed to each other, the entirety of the shrine plain became awash with elation and celebration. While there were a minority of jealous and callous individuals, the vast majority were genuinely happy. It was as though these two were a match made in heaven, a truly worthy pairing. However, it had to be said that these two were still very young in relation to the true experts of the shrine plain. While they had potential, it could not be said that this potential had fully blossomed. Of course, despite this, Titus and Himari still earned the title of the number 1 and 2 experts of the shrine plain. In fact, many believed that they were perfectly equal in battle prowess. The only reason Titus took first place was because he displayed his abilities in the public eye more often. This, also coupled with the fact that Titus took his father's mantle as priest Saint while Himari had yet to do the same, allowed the world to reach this conclusion about their ranking. One had to understand that these titles were meaningful, but only to a certain extent. They were passed along to members of the younger generation, by the oldest because many old monsters had long since graduated from the need to take such titles for themselves. In one's youth, fighting for prestige was a matter of pride and a rite of passage, but after one passes a certain point, fighting it out with youth starts to become beneath them. This was the way of the martial world, or at least it should have been, until Titus and Himary shattered the notion completely. The battle prowess they displayed made it clear that whether it was the younger or elder generations, they were worthy of crushing both. When hidden enemies learned of this truth, they became dormant. The impact of Ryu's presence on this timeline was so forceful that matters of up became down, and those of left became right. Nothing made sense anymore. If they wanted to take a single step forward, they'd have to take 3 steps back. Still, there was another piece of news that partially flew under the radar due to the pomp and circumstance of the first 4. But this one was not any less intriguing. The appearance of Nuri shook the souls of those learned enough to understand. Why had Gale attacked with such naked abandon? Why had old Mistress Holy Wing not acted to stop him, even knowing the rage that would ensue? Was not it obvious that bearing the brunt of the Tatsuya clan's rage was not worth it if Ryu survived anyway? It was simple. Despite their cultivations, despite their experience, none of them sensed Nuri. How could there be such a powerful expert hidden away in the Tatsuya clan? To even be able to hide amidst thousands of members of the oldest generation without a single one sensing her? How? Days later, Ryu's eyes blinked open to find himself staring at a familiar ceiling. To his side, Alina laid like a small kitten, holding onto his arm tightly as though he would disappear at any moment. Ryu could not help but smile. She was too adorable. A small hint of sunlight illuminated her pink, crystal-like hair. To the side of her soft lips, a clear line of drool fell to the pillow she rested her head on. However, maybe the most alluring part was the curve of her body. Wrapped in a gauze-like fabric that showed off the perfection of her figure, she slept soundly. Of course, immortals with cultivation as deep as Alina did not need sleep. Even if she was required to stay awake for thousands of years, it would be an easy task. But she had gotten into the habit of doing so because Ryu was a mortal who could not do such things. Every night without fail for the last 600 or so years, she had slept by his side. Alina shifted in her sleep, stirring awake before absent-mindedly wiping the drool from her face. "Hubby, you are awake." Alina's face lit up with elation, grabbing Ryu's face and kissing his cheek happily. With Ryu's frail body, how could he stop her from doing as she pleased? Even after so many years, Ryu could not get over Alina's free spirit, for lack of a better term. She was jumping around so fiercely, but did not she realize that her bountiful chest was putting him under a hypnotic spell? No matter how cold he was not he still a man? Must she subject him to such torture? Her gown was incapable of hiding anything. Aside from the beautiful laced underwear that hid her most precious parts, her breasts were practically laid bare to Ryu. Everything from their soft elasticity to the erect pink and healthy point that graced their center, it was all there. Alina covered her lips with a delicate hand, giggling coquettishly. "If you stare so much, I will blush." Ryu coughed, looking away and rolling his eyes. "The day this woman blushes is the day the world comes to an end, and the sun rises no more. If you wanted me to be your nice, obedient little wife, you could have taken me long ago," Alina said with an adorable pout, her waist rippling upward as her arms raised above her head in a long stretch. "What happened?" Ryu asked, trying to change the subject. "Mother and father," Alina spoke, obviously referring to Ryu's parents, "were very angry and taught that old lady a lesson. As for Gale, he's dead, but the Ventus clan has been oddly silent. It seems that Priest St. Ventus suffered a small injury in his anger." "I see." Ryu sighed. He had completely lost consciousness at the time, but he faintly understood what must have happened for his parents to react so violently. "The good news is that you received a lot of goodies. After Gale died and the old mistress was brought to the doors of death, many in attendance wanted to leave as quickly as possible, but no one dared to do so without making their well wishes known. After seeing the heavenly couple's true battle prowess, They no longer harbored any thoughts of disdain or complacency. So how could they leave without parting with presents for the young heir? Elena giggled. They were all scrambling to see who could curry the larger favor. That coupled with that evil plot of yours, and the Tatsuya clan reaped quite a few rewards. Ryu smiled lightly. His so-called evil plot was just something he had said on a whim to vent some of his frustration. He had been planning to let them off the hook after allowing them to squirm a little, but it seems that even if he had been awake to do so, they would not have dared accept his mercy. Just hand everything to the clan treasurers. I do not need such things anyway. It's better if the clan can make use of them. Ryu's words seemed nonchalant and light, but Elena frowned, catching a double meaning within them. Are you trying to say that the clan will need such treasures? Ryu was a bit surprised by how sharp Elena was. Truthfully, he should have long since been used to this by now. Elena had always been a free spirit who lived life as she saw fit, but with that came a deep sensitivity to those around her. She was so in tune with herself that she often reached out to others to share. It was a subconscious dream of hers for everyone to taste the freedom she had. Her heart was simply that large. From the outside looking in, Elena and Ryu should have never been together. To call their personalities polar was inappropriate, only because the description did not go far enough. It was not a simple matter of opposites attracting one another, because their dispositions were so different that they could not be considered mere opposites. Still, what brought them together was exactly this virtue of Elena's. She saw Ryu as a man who seemingly had everything, yet was shackled more than anyone else. While others saw a pampered young master, she saw a frail heir with a shadow over his soul. While for Ryu, maybe he was subconsciously attracted to this freedom Elena had. Maybe he wanted to understand just what it meant. Ryu was arrogant. He felt that he was beyond this arrogance, believing that he deserved a loftier label. But did he? Was not his disposition just as shallow as the 9-lettered title attached to him? How could such a seemingly strong individual could be so weak? Ryu seemed to take pride in his will to fight. He seemed to find light where there was none and victory where there was only defeat. He repeated these feats countless times in his mere 1,000 years of life. Yet this very same Ryu feared his ability to read fate. This very same Ryu refused to take his woman into his arms and give her the love she deserved. This very same Ryu accepted his mortality without an ounce of resistance. How can both things be true in a single person? How can you claim to be above all things, yet have such a profound weakness within you? How can you claim to be mighty when you are really so frail? This was Ryu's life. He was a man without freedom, a man shackled by his own insecurities, a man unwilling to fight. Ryu blinked at Elena's question, his vision slightly blurring. He felt a swarm of enlightenment bombard him. It was as though his life was laid out, and its every scene could be easily picked apart by him. The first thing Ryu realized was that his memory was never this good. As a mortal, he had never had perfect recall. Such a thing was reserved for those with the highest levels of cultivation, and was also restricted by the complexity of the material being remembered. For example, an expert of his father's caliber could remember a common grade technique with a single glance, but an origin grade technique was something even Titus was not capable of memorizing. Is this the origin flame's doing? Ryu, hubby? Elena lay a delicate hand on Ryu's forehead when she noticed his breathing quicken. Could it be that the origin flame is not as docile as records say? Why else would her fiancé have been unconscious for 3 days yet still react like this? Ryu cleared his throat. I'm fine. His voice carried a slight weakness, but it had a foundation of firmness. I only meant that the movements of the clans during that night were too odd. The most obvious was Gale's recklessness. That has to stem from somewhere. It's better to be safe than sorry. Too many kingdoms in history have fallen during their absolute peaks. Oh, Elena's flashed with an odd light, but she did not pursue it. I knew you would say that about the treasures, but I kept a few for you that actually could be useful. Useful to me. Ryu laid on the bed, looking up at the ceiling with a blank expression. Are you sure? Elena giggled. If your lovely fiancé says so, should not you believe her? One is a mystical grade treasure. Another is an origin grade treasure, and the last is a unique grade treasure. Ryu's eyes had been slowly closing before those last words left Alina's lips, but the instant he registered them, they snapped open with an added vigor. "What'd you just say? I thought you were not interested." HM. Alina looked away, pretending not to notice Ryu's gaze. In the void, Nura's beautiful laughter sounded before she covered her delicate red lips and blushed. It was truly an odd sight, considering no one could hear her anyway. The grading of treasures was very similar to the grading of bloodlines. The only difference here is that the sovereign grade is replaced by the mystical grade. Aside from this, it follows the same pattern: common, black, earth, heaven, mystical, ancestral, and origin. However, what's obvious here is that the unique grade is not mentioned at all. This is because a unique grade treasure is impossible to properly categorize. It was not necessarily more powerful than an origin grade treasure either. In fact, in some rare cases, it was not even worth the common grade label. Still, what one could never doubt was that the fact that these were all treasures that existed outside the bounds of heavenly laws. Ryu smiled bitterly. This fiancé of his truly was far too willful. However, he could not say that he did not deserve it. Even he realized that he neglected her, why she had chosen him even to the point of falling out with her family. He had no idea. There was a small part of Ryu that still believed she was only throwing a small temper tantrum. He would only live for a fraction of her life anyway. By the time he died, she'd have more than long enough to reconcile with the Holy Wing clan. In fact, although such a thought caused a dull ache in his chest, he hoped that it was true if for nothing else but her sake. "I'm sorry." Ryu grasped Alina's waist, pulling her into his arms and allowing her to rest on his chest. Despite being an immortal, Alina weighed as light as a feather. Of course, this was in part due to her special skeletal structure. It was a simple task for Ryu to lift her even with his frail body. In his life, Alina was the only one who deserved to hear these words from him. "Good," Alina harumphed triumphantly, curling into Ryu. "They are all very good treasures, even the mystical grade one. Although its rank is low, its abilities are very interesting. I believe it would be very difficult to make a treasure that replicated its abilities, but also had a higher grade." Oh, Ryu would be lying if he said he was not intrigued. He was certain that if Alina picked these three out of the thousands that were likely given, they likely had the ability to give him an added layer of protection. Alina was obviously no less protective of him than his parents. The only reason it's not a higher grade itself is because its usefulness is reliant on both the skill and cultivation of the person who uses it. Ryu smiled wryly. "I have no cultivation to speak of. How could I make full use of this?" "Silly hubby, how could I not know that? Although you do not have cultivation, what you do have is a very strong mental realm foundation. This treasure can feed off this as well, which was why it caught my eye." Alina reached her arm out, not bothering to sit up as a silver ring on her hand warped slightly to reveal a black cloak. Its fabric was incomparably smooth, almost like satin fur. However, the most intriguing part was that the cloak itself seemed ethereal, despite the fact it was clearly laying on his chest. "It's also good because I know how much you like to wear black. From my tests, if you entered the breath of Earth state while wearing this cloak, it would be difficult for even me to find you as long as you remained still." Ryu took the cloak into his hands with a pensive expression. He knew that he could only enter the breath of Earth state for only a few seconds, because his spiritual chi could not sustain it. But to say that he could hide from an immortal as a cripple, even if it was just a few seconds, was astounding. Of course, there were numerous caveats such as remaining still and likely not allowing any intent he had to leak, but it was still an astounding feat. Nonetheless, the only thing holding this cloak back from a higher grade was the fact it relied on its user. Higher grade treasures were amazing no matter how unskilled their master was. "Do not think of using it to peep on me in the bath, okay?" Alina stuck her small pink tongue out playfully. Ryu shook his head, involuntarily smiling himself as he took the cloak into his heavenly pupil inner world. He had never bothered to carry around a spatial ring because of this innate ability. He and all other heavenly pupil wielders were born with. Of course, this ability was a big deal in the mortal planes where spatial rings were rare and expensive. But here, it was inconsequential. That first one is for your protection, but this second one is one I think you will take a fancy to. It's an origin-grade incubator. It's able to accelerate the speed of growth in both beasts and spiritual plants alike by 100 times. Ryu raised another eyebrow. Do not, we have plenty of those already. What's special about this one? This origin-grade evaluation seems a bit high for what amounts to only 100 times. Alina seemed to be enjoying this side of their interactions far too much. Usually, Ryu was the one with all the answers while she asked all the questions. She could not help but revel in this flip. This aside, Ryu was not wrong. The Tatsuya clan even had such incubators that multiplied maturing speed by 1,000, even 10 and 100,000 times. This seemed like a lot, but for some spiritual plants, it took several trillion years to fully mature. Cutting the time down by this much was not a luxury, it was a necessity. The issue was that even those incubators did not receive origin-grade evaluations. One had to understand just how rare an origin-grade treasure was. Even their large clans would only have 2 or 3, and they were the highest existences in the martial world. How could such an evaluation be given out so easily? Alina smiled deviously. What makes this one special despite its low acceleration is the fact it can 1. Fuse into its master's body and 2. Directly process spiritual plants into pure Kai to speed up anything from healing to cultivation. Also, you can directly control the pace of flow of the already processed Kai. With it, you will have no restrictions on the spiritual plant grades you can intake, and you will not have to worry about exploding from excessive energy. Hearing this explanation, Ryu's heart warmed. Why else would Alina be so eager to give him this treasure, if not to lengthen his life? The most troublesome part about extending a mortal's life was finding treasures docile enough to not directly kill them. This completely eliminated this issue. This was what it meant to be an origin-grade treasure. This incubator had no need for Ryu to be some elite expert, because it covered for his flaws itself. But who, Ryu suddenly said, who would give up an origin-grade treasure? Before, Ryu had been caught off guard by the unique grade title, but it had to be said that the origin grade should have been just as shocking to him. His own Tatsuya clan only had 3 under complete lock and key. Even he could not see them whenever he wanted. On the entire shrine plain, there were likely only a bit more than a dozen of them total. Alina's eyes flashed with an angered light. Mother and father forced the Holy Wing clan to cough it up in exchange for that old witch's life and in apology for her actions. Alina's words alluded to a story Ryu knew little about. This incubator of the Holy Wing clan had long been known to his Tatsuya clan. Years ago, during Titus' first stay at the shrine library, and directly after his Meridian Awakening ceremony failed, his grandma Kunin had put aside her pride and hatred to ask if it was possible to trade for this treasure. One had to understand that although this origin-grade incubator was a heavenly treasure few could match, its use was still highly limited. In fact, the only way to make full use of it was to give it a single master. But obviously, something like this was less useful for such a large clan. A defensive or offensive origin-grade treasure was simply far more valuable. However, old Mistress Holy Wing would never miss an opportunity to scorn her old rival, even knowing that this involved the life and death of a child, even knowing that accepting this origin-grade treasure trade would greatly benefit her clan. She rejected the offer after humiliating Ryu's grandmother. Now she was forced to exchange this treasure for nothing, simply to save her own life. It could be said that justice had been meted out. I see, Ryu said softly. Alina did not need to say anything more. With Ryu's intelligence, he immediately understood what must have happened. Although he did not have the exact details, the scenario he built in his mind was not far from the truth. Here, Alina's spatial ring warped once more, revealing what looked like a beautiful globe with a world hidden within. Even with his mortal vision, Ryu could see endless flowing rivers and grassed lands. But there were no trees or spiritual plants to speak of. Even the water was normal, without any special properties. Alina shook her head. It's only to be expected. The Holy Wing clan definitely took everything valuable out before handing it over. It should be fine, though. With your abilities, you will be able to fill it with even rarer spiritual plants. Be a little selfish for me, okay? Do not always hand your achievements off to those old council fogies. Keep some for yourself. A rare air of seriousness took control of Alina's tone. She did not know why she suddenly felt so uncomfortable, as though a weight was slowly increasing on her chest. But she always believed in her instincts. It was part of why she always felt so free. Be a little selfish, huh? Ryu muttered to himself as he took the globe in his hand. The heavenly pupil inner world was quite bland. It seemed to be an odd gray box that increased in size, along with your cultivation. Yet even as a mortal, Ryu's space was about 10 meters in every direction. Aside from the cloak that now sat neatly folded in a corner, there was not much else to see. All that remained was the fire dragon emblem of the Tatsuya clan, the phoenix emblems of the ice and fire phoenix clans, and the lightning Qilin emblem of the Kunnan clan. These emblems were mystical grade treasures that allowed access to the various clan holy lands. But other than that, they had no other function. I believe you should be able to replace your heavenly pupil inner world with this one, at least in theory, Alina explained lightly. As Alina expected, the process was seamless. The globe entered Ryu's forehead, slowly changing his inner world. Now, its world could accommodate living beings. Unfortunately, though, his cultivation was non-existent, making it impossible for him to withstand the burden of warping in large objects. Nodding in satisfaction, Alina smiled. The last treasure is probably one you will have some pushback against, but do remember that it's a unique grade treasure. Some pushback. Ryu's mind immediately went to the worst possible place. This fiancée of his did not get him some kinky toy, did she? Alina giggled, as though reading Ryu's mind. Do not worry, it's nothing like that. Instead, they are weapons. Twin daggers, actually. Ryu frowned, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. What the hell would he do with weapons? Right now, Ryu had no fighting experience whatsoever other than basics his father taught him when he was a toddler. What use would he have for daggers? I know, but I've thought about this seriously. The black cloak has a passive ability to conceal, but it's very weak. Without cultivation, the only way you can evoke its true abilities is to use your spiritual chi and enter the breath of Earth realm. However, that only lasts for a few seconds. Do you think that your enemy would disappear in that time? You need to take action, Alina said seriously. Ryu sighed. Your words make sense, but in a case where I assume something has happened to Nuri, and I'm forced into such a corner, even if I have an origin-grade dagger, I'm afraid that such an enemy would only laugh at my attack. This is why these daggers are special. They are capable of accommodating all forms of energy, including spiritual chi. Their weight also changes in accordance with the energy type and amount you use. You mean? Ryu raised an eyebrow. You can attack an opponent's mental realm directly. This will not guarantee a kill, considering even someone like Nuri could not instantly end Gale's life. But it's the most effective attack you have. It's better than nothing. Listening to this point, Ryu could not disagree. This was indeed the most effective form of attack he had. If these daggers really could accept spiritual chi, then they could protect Ryu's mind while he attacked others. Simple put, they were better than having nothing at all, so, for the sake of his fiancée's peace of mind, he accepted the daggers. Ryu watched as Alina handed him two beautifully finished daggers. Each had a black spine, but edges that shone a crystalline and translucent blue. These edges were serrated into 3 portions, making the daggers look like a slanted set of triplet canine teeth. Their handles were long and slender, curving near the end into spherical bulbs. The entire length of each blade was only about 1.5 feet, hilt included, but they gave off a menacing light. The night of that very same day, Ryu sat under the cool dark air, his black robes fluttering along with the thin drapes that whipped in the wind behind him. He was currently on a balcony extending from his and Alina's room. While she slept soundly once more, he could not bring himself to. Scenes of his life kept replaying in his mind like a record. Memories he had not thought of in centuries were suddenly becoming crystal clear, whether he wanted them to or not. He could remember how excited his father was after his birth. A man with the weight of an entire plane on his shoulders ignored it all to spend time with his son. Ryu remembered the early morning hikes to Shrine Mountain. He remembered how diligently his father taught him the Tatsuya clan martial forms. He remembered the bright smile of pride on his face when he became convinced that his son would shake the shrine plain even fiercer than he had. But with those memories of good came memories of anguish. He could remember his father's despair when his meridian awakening ceremony failed. He remembered feeling pain because he knew that his father was not hurt by having a crippled son, but hurt by the prospect of what it meant for Ryu himself. The love in his father's eyes never faded. It just became balanced with a pain that Ryu could not ignore, a pain that Ryu, a young boy who was so used to seeing a single side of his father, could not help but run away from. Ryu also remembered his mother. He remembered laying in her arms and clinging to her breast's milk desperately. Imagine that, a woman of her stature personally feeding her own child. This was the love his mother had for him, suffering through the pains and aches of an overly eager, oversized baby boy with a loving twinkle in her eye. She never lost that desire to provide and protect. Not once had she ever. His grandparents were another light of his life. His grandma Kunin was always the soothing voice in his ear. It was she who chased away his father and grandfathers when their training became too harsh back in those days. His grandma Tatsuya was a far more reserved and stoic lady, but her smile had long since been reserved for her baby boy. It was her who gifted Ryu his best toys, even though a toddler had no business playing around with heaven-grade treasures. His grandpa Tatsuya was a man of very few words. In fact, Ryu could likely count the number of times he'd spoken to this grandfather of his to an accurate estimate. However, it was because he was so silent that he conveyed his love through his actions. It was he who had found the most herbs and spiritual treasures capable of extending Ryu's life, even spending decades and sometimes centuries away in pursuit of them. Grandpa Kunin was likely the polar opposite of Grandpa Tatsuya. He was rambunctious and loud, but his heart was just as big as his personality was. It was he who found Ryu first after his meridian awakening ceremony failed, slapping him on his small shoulders and hugging him tightly. At that time, he told Ryu that a man never gives up, that a man finds a way to succeed no matter what cards he was dealt. If it was not for Grandpa Kunin, Ryu did not know if he would have recovered enough to set a new path for himself by entering Shrine Library. Then there was Nuri. Ryu had always seen her as his big sister, a woman always there to protect him. The truth was that Nuri was a little girl his parents had adopted before his birth. At the time, they had been trying for several millennia to birth a child to no avail. It was then that Nuri fell like a heavenly treasure from the skies. They fell in love with the little baby girl immediately, taking her in as one of their own. When Nuri grew and Ryu was finally born, she wanted to repay this debt of gratitude. Having never known her own parents, to her, the Tatsuya clan was the only family she'd ever recognize. She did not even blink an eye when she swore a tribulation oath to protect Ryu for life. Ryu remembered patting his little chest as a boy, no more than 3 or 4 years old, swearing that when he grew up, he would take Nuri as his wife. Then it would be his turn to protect her. Nuri had smiled brightly, that beautiful smile of hers. She rubbed his small head and nodded with happiness. And Alina, she had a place in Ryu's heart that was unshakable. When she came into his life, he had not thought that he would ever open up that side of himself to anyone until his death took him from this world. Was it even fair of him to do so? How could he promise love to a woman he would not be able to sustain? It was then that Alina had said those ill-fated words to him. Be selfish. What a funny idea. Words with such a negative connotation, used to light a path to happiness in a man who had all but given up on everything. Ryu's face shifted up, allowing him to catch a glance at the 3 moons in the sky. The 2 smaller shone a beautiful red and blue, but the largest was seemingly reminiscent of Ryu's fate star, blazing with a gray-white color. Ryu had heard that Shrine Plain had 3 suns as well, but the largest was so bright that the smaller 2 were impossible to see. A slight breeze passed, causing Ryu to frown. He lifted his hand to his cheek, only to be shocked to find that it was wet. Huh? Ryu's voice croaked. He could not remember the last time he felt so weak. Could it be that he had not felt this way since that day 993 years ago, the very day his ceremony failed, and his remaining prospects became bleak? Ryu knew what he had to do. He had known since the moment the embryonic origin flame fused, and enlightened him with the will of the universe. Formerly confusing lines of fate and karma became clear and obvious. Ambiguous and abstruse paths forward fused into a single heavenly lane. Things could not continue as they were. It was not a simple matter of Ryu's happiness. It about the life and death of the 4 clans that mattered most to him along with countless others. But he was scared. He was scared to the point of trembling, of tears falling down his face, even to the point of wanting to vomit, both in disgust toward his own cowardice and anguish at the prospect of what lay ahead. Ryu closed his eyes, his jaw clenching. Moments later, he stood and walked back into the room he shared with Alina. With a heavy weight laying on his heart, he kneeled beside her sleeping body to gently stroke her soft cheek. The instant Alina moaned awake, he lowered his lips to hers. "Hubby." Alina awoke fully to a set of cold lips on hers. Yet she felt a sense of warmth and comfort when she saw that set of silver eyes looking down at her. Ryu's eyes were slightly red, still lingering with remnants of his stored emotions. Still, they had an outpouring of tenderness and love that was rare for him. How long had Alina waited to see this very gaze? How many nights had she dreamt of being awoken by this very kiss that still tingled along her lips? So why did she feel her eyes watering? Why was her chest aching with this disgusting bittersweet feeling? "Alina." Ryu's voice was barely a whisper, as though he feared a louder volume would betray its trembling. "Will you allow me to be selfish?" The fluttering of Alina's heart quickened. She cupped her fiancé's cheeks, sinking her warmth into their cold. Without a word, she pulled Ryu down to her, almost melding their bodies into one. Alina pretended not to notice the moistness that now coated her palms, nor did she hold back her own. She simply immersed herself in the feeling of Ryu's body, delicately removing his robes to reveal his broad but frail chest. Ryu tried to reciprocate, but his attempts at a gentle, caressing touches were thwarted by his shaking hands. Voices of doubt and discontent rang in his ears. "Is this really how you want to do it? She deserves better than this. Can you even call yourself a man?" Maybe it was due to these voices, or maybe it was because he so wanted to forget his own thoughts, but the trembling slowly disappeared. Alina's soft body fell into his embrace, not an ounce of which was lost on him. Her gown was pulled over her head, revealing skin so soft Ryu almost felt as though he was sinking into a warm cloud. His lips dotted her curvature as he breathed in her intoxicating fragrance. Alina squirmed under his touch, eagerly lifting her hips to rid herself of the final layer that separated them. No matter how cool-headed Ryu was, it was impossible for him to remain unaffected. To those residing in the mortal plane, such a sight was impossible to see. In their eyes, the cultivators who resided here were their gods and goddesses. If Alina appeared, she would be no less than an immortal fairy in their eyes, because this was how even Ryu saw her. This was not the first time Ryu had seen his fiancée naked. In fact, it was not even the 100th or 1000th. But something about the sheen of fragrant sweat on her delicate skin, the faint blush on her healthy cheeks, and the almost pleading expression in her eyes lit a fire within Ryu. He caressed her cheek, tender affection clear in his eyes. "I want you to know that I will never leave you. No matter what happens, can you promise me that you will remember this?" Alina's pink, crystalline eyes reflected the moonlight as she looked at her fiancé. Unable to trust her words, she nodded. A sudden nervousness overtook Ryu. Not only was he completely inexperienced, seemingly inconsequential thoughts suddenly felt that now was the time to make their presence known. Would he hurt her? How fast should he go? He was just a mortal. What if he could not satisfy his immortal fiancée? Did Alina care about such things? Should he assume that she wanted to have a child now, or should he take precautions? Damn it, he had not prepared. What precautions could he possibly take now? It was not until a light giggle sounded in Ryu's ears that he realized his cold, handsome features had given way to panic. He could not help but blush slightly. Still, those feelings were washed away the moment he felt a soft hand grab onto him from below, guiding him toward a wonderful place filled with moist warmth, love, and desire. I'm willing to allow you to be selfish, but I need one thing from you first, Alina said softly. Her voice was a bit haggard, suffused with a raspy breath that rose and fell along with her ample chest. Even though her hair had also become an absolute mess, it only made her all the more alluring as it clung to her sweat-matted forehead. Ryu did not let her finish. He knew her next words, and she accepted them wholeheartedly. In the martial world, marriage more than just a simple ceremony. What distinguished wives from concubines was a tradition that dated back several eras, even to the start of the first human civilizations. A husband and wife were not just a man and woman. They were two sides of the same coin. It was a union that was wholly sacred, one that bound the fates of two people together for a lifetime and lifetimes. For the first time in his life, Ryu fully opened his soul to another. Although Alina trembled at the sight she saw, she too reciprocated. In the next moment, their thoughts became one. Nothing of Ryu's was hidden to Alina, nor was anything of Alina's hidden to Ryu. They had come to have a perfect understanding of each other the moment. A dull pain pierced Alina's senses. You, Alina Tatsuya, will forever be Ryu Tatsuya's wife. In life and in death, we walk together. In sadness and happiness, we feel together. In this reincarnation and the next, our souls will always be one. A swirling of turbid primordial yin and yang filled the room. Moans of passion and fervent desire ricocheted across the walls. Ryu's nervousness had fled, as a sense of freedom pervaded his mind. Alina's wants and needs were no longer a mystery to him. In the end, Alina fell into his embrace and a satisfied sleep, once more clinging to her fiancé's arm, as though she was afraid he would disappear. Maybe ironically, this fear that Alina had irrationally held for so long became reality the next morning. Nura's shrill cry of sorrow and pain shook Tatsuya Palace. Alina did not even need to open her eyes to know that her husband was no longer by her side. An empty void, the likes of which seemed to encompass the whole of existence, was all that was left behind. She knew exactly what had happened. She had felt his fear and hesitation, his tears and resolution, and finally she had felt his death. The matters of the shrine plain became a blip in history. However, this was not because Ryu was too insignificant, but was simply due to the fact that the occurrences after his death were simply far too tragic, an event the likes of which had not been seen since the great ancient beast war ravaged the shrine plain. In the face of such a reality, the death of a mortal man who had only lived to his 1000th birthday was inconsequential, while his death was absolutely devastating to a minority. In the grand scheme, he became yet another forgotten hero. These matters would remain unchanged for 9 cycles of 100 million years. The wail of a woman shook a grandly decorated imperial harem. One could not help but be shocked at the power hidden in her lungs. Who would have thought that a woman without much cultivation to speak of could make such a sound? 3 middle-aged doulas sprinted as fast as their chubby and short legs could carry them, rushing to and from the woman's bedside. One carried buckets of water, another brought fresh and replaced worn towels, while the last massaged the protruding belly of the wailing woman, her palms glowing as she muttered under her breath. It was clear by the expressions of the 3 doulas that they had never dealt with such a severe labor period. It had already been 3 days since first concubine Leilani had been appropriately dilated to begin actively pushing. Yet in all this time, there had been no real progress. This was supposed to be a happy occasion. The king's favorite concubine was finally giving birth after more than a decade of failure. If they were on duty and became responsible for the king's loss of a son, execution would be the least of their worries. who did not know how much the king treasured his heirs. There was a long stretch of time, decades in fact, where the king only had 2 daughters to speak of. Although this had changed in just the last 4 or so years, the king still retained some of that latent anxiety. They could not afford to fail. In the largest courtyard of the imperial harem grounds, a beautiful young woman leisurely reclined as though the wails of first concubine Leilani were nothing but music to her ears. It was at that moment that a shadow flashed into the room, appearing behind the woman silently. "Why have you come?" The young woman's eyes flashed coldly. "There's been a problem." "A problem?" Her eyes narrowed, clearly unhappy with these words. Although Imperial Doula Miriam is an insignificant creature, her skill in childbirth and rearing is unmatched in our Tor kingdom. With her pride, if the child had died, even if it meant her death, she would have announced as much. "Are you trying to tell me that a mere unborn child could survive such a poison?" The young woman sneered. It was obvious what she was implying. There was not a chance in hell such a thing was possible. If there was a failure, it was human, meaning whoever administered the poison was the one responsible, and the one who was tasked with this was none other than the shadow that stood to her back. The shadow did not know how to respond. His life and death rested on a mere word from this queen. If she truly decided to blame him, there was not a place in the entire plane he could hide. Wiping away his cold sweat, the shadow immediately explained himself. "Queen Tor, please understand. I am certain that I've done my job appropriately. If the child has survived the meridian-severing poison as an unborn, this simply means that he is, or rather, was, an astounding talent. Whether he is born or not, he will no longer be a threat." The young woman remained quiet for a long time. To the shadow, it felt like an eternity, but in truth, it was no more than a handful of minutes. "Return to the clan and give yourself 10 lashes of the punishment rod. I will forgive this matter for now. Indeed, watching her crumble due to having birthed a useless son will be far more gratifying." The young woman laughed to herself as the shadow bowed and disappeared. No one noticed that fact. A man who was not a eunuch had entered where he should not have. First concubine Leilani pushed with what remaining strength she had. In all honesty, she had long since wanted to give up. Why was she, of all people, given the trial of such a difficult labor? She had been pampered her whole life. Nothing had ever been difficult, but suddenly an impossible-to-scale mountain had landed directly before her. She wanted to sleep and rest. She wanted to take a bath and wipe this crusted sweat from her body, but this old hag kept applying pressure on her womb. Why would not she just stop? "Let me just lie here," she screamed in her mind. It was then that the cry of a child sounded throughout the imperial harem. It seemed that this child inherited his vocal cords from his mother. His loud bellowing was followed by the abrupt opening of the courtyard's doors. A man of imposing aura and will rushed into the room, ignoring all ceremony to reach the bedside of the now collapsed first concubine Leilani. "Your Majesty, it is not the right time for you to enter. The poor boy still needs to be cleaned and prepped." Imperial Doula Miriam tried to explain. This was not the first time the king had had a child. He should know these things by now. Usually, King Tor would have awkwardly scratched his head at the berating of this older, middle-aged woman. Yet at the moment, his face had contorted at the sight of his son. Imperial Doula Miriam panicked, looking at the baby in her arms to see if he had any obvious defects. But her only conclusion was confusion. Why did such a healthy baby evoke such a reaction? It should have been a happy occasion. These were words many aware of the situation likely thought. The birth of the 4th prince of the mighty Tor kingdom. The king who had spent so long without an heir suddenly had 4 of them. He should have been ecstatic. However, there was a looming dark cloud over Tor Palace. It had to be said that even Imperial Doula Miriam was confused by this turn of events. She was well aware of her own abilities, as was everyone else. She had helped hundreds of noble women give birth over her lifetime. In fact, she had even waited on the previous queen in giving birth to the current King Tor. To say that she was experienced was a severe understatement. When she received the young baby in her arms, she found not a single defect. In fact, after a few days passed and the young boy's skin cleared and stretched, she was certain that he would grow to be even more handsome than his father. After some thought, she decided to do a deeper inspection. After all, the king's cultivation was far more profound than her own. The only martial techniques she knew were related to healing, while her cultivation was still at the pulse-opening realm. However, the seasoned Miriam was still very much confused. Even though the king's cultivation was deeper than hers, her sensory abilities, especially in relation to babies and their mothers, should have been unmatched. As she expected, after doing a deeper examination of the child, she found him to be the picture of health. His bones were strong, his blood was pure, and his meridians were actually a great surprise. Usually, the meridians of newborns were very frail. This was why the meridian awakening ceremony did not take place until 7 years old. However, this young boy here seemed as though he could take his ceremony right this moment and come out perfectly fine. Of course, there were other restrictions as well, such as one's spiritual foundation. It was a combination of meridian maturity and this that made it general consensus to wait until the age of 7. The mother will survive. The boy is not only healthy, he's even far more talented than his elder brothers and sisters. Even though I'm just a week-old lady, I'm certain that if the heavenly body sect knew of this boy, they would come snatch him up immediately. So why did the king react in that way? Imperial doula Miriam muttered to herself. Shaking her head, she decided that matters of the royal family were no business of her own. Call Liliana in here, the boy is hungry, she suddenly called out, walking with the little boy in her arms with a doting expression. She did not know why, but she was very fond of this baby boy. Because she felt this way, how could she not choose the wet nurse with the perkiest breasts for her little treasure? Forgive me for my candor, your majesty, but we must take drastic measures. I understand that he is your son, but the heavens have blessed you with 3 other heirs. A minister of the imperial palace spoke slowly, standing within the imperial court, while the others of the palace had no idea why such a happy occasion had turned so foul. The upper echelons definitely understood. In fact, they had begun taking the utmost precautions in dealing with the matter. Although they had not said it, their eyes displayed their emotions clearly. Kill the boy. A baleful aura erupted from the king. Had these fools never fathered children of their own? What kind of nonsense was this? I have 3 others, so it's fine to kill the 4th. Censor Digby, Censor Orson, Censor Briggs. What are your thoughts on the matter? The king's expression was grave and his eyes were sharp. In just the last few days, his healthy black beard had become rife with strings of gray and white. It was clear to everyone how much this situation weighed on his mind. He was a handsome young man in his own right. Although he was already 50 or so years old today, his cultivation was deep enough to maintain his looks. He would not have to worry about the end of his life for another 150 years. Yet he had gained the heart of an old man in what amounted to less than a week. In reality, this meeting should have taken place immediately, but he had put it off. Censor Digby stepped forward first. He was an old, wizened man with a beard, as long as his lengthy head of white hair. In truth, he was only 10 or so years older than the king, but he had no cultivation to speak of, so this was his appearance. Your Majesty, Censor Digby bowed deeply. You have known for a long time that the role of imperial censors is to uphold the moral code and culture of our wonderful kingdom. On the one hand, this old servant believes that it is morally reprehensible to kill a newborn child, no matter the reason. On the other, there needs to be measures taken. The 4th prince cannot live a normal life. The cards he's been dealt are too cruel to ignore. Censor Orson was the newest of the imperial censors, having only recently been promoted from a certain minister rank. As such, he was relatively young, being only 40 or so years old. However, he suffered from the same lack of cultivation and frail body Censor Digby did. Your Majesty, Censor Orson bowed, I am young and rash. I hope that my words do not offend you. However, it must be said that the world is cruel, and the time is nigh. Although the boy was born with this cruel fate, Imperial doula Miriam has reported that He's a heavenly talent the likes of which few have ever seen. If he is allowed to grow, I fear that Tor Kingdom will suffer from internal strife." The king's finger twitched. If he did not know the fallout it would cause, he would have immediately killed this man for daring to speak such words before him. But in the end, he simply allowed the morbidly obese Censor Briggs to step forward. "Your Majesty," despite his size, Censor Briggs too made the effort to bow. "This lowly servant will speak his opinion now. Although the matter is as dangerous as Censor Orson describes, and is as sensitive as Censor Digby portrays, we must also not forget that a father killing his son will also stain the morale of the kingdom. In fact, even if this information never spreads and the fourth prince comes to be known as a stillborn, it will still have ill effects. This lowly servant suggests that we use more roundabout methods. One might wonder why a king with so much power in his hands would ever care to listen to this opinion of those who amounted to simple mere mortals. However, it was important to understand just how critical the role of an imperial censor was. In fact, they are purposely chosen to be mortal so that they can maintain proper perspective. When a country or kingdom is formed, the most powerful strength its leaders can wield is nationalism. This fervent and almost basal instinct of a person born in a certain place to be biased toward their home. It is because of this nationalism and loyalty that governments can maintain themselves over generations, while it's often due to a lack of it that they fall prematurely. No matter how much individual strength King Tor wields, there would come a day where he would have no choice but to hand his life's work to the next generation. When this occurs, he needs to ensure that the people still believe in the royal family and are willing to pledge their loyalty for another ruler's span. After this, it then becomes the next ruler's duty to maintain this tradition. The date of this event was closer than one might think. Although King Tor's current lifespan was more than 200 years, this did not mean that he would rule for 150 more. According to the rules and regulations of their plane, experts of a certain cultivation must recede from the so-called secular world. Given King Tor's talent, it would not be much more than 15 to 20 more years before he would be forced by these ancient traditions to abdicate. Knowing this, King Tor could not in good conscience leave his kingdom in turmoil, even if he slowed his cultivation purposely to match the upper limit of this time. Something that was morally gray according to the rules they followed. His eldest son would not even be 25 years old. This simply was not enough time to resolve this conflict. This was not the worst of matter either. Up until now, only abstract matters such as nationalism and loyalty were touched upon. However, there was a very real and tangible measure of this in the martial world: fate. This was the greatest task of the imperial censors, to ensure that Tor Kingdom's faith was always maintained at the highest possible levels. Without the protection of such faith, a kingdom could face many potential issues. These matters could include crop failures, the spread of disease, lower fertility rates. The list was simply too long and catastrophic to comb through. King Tor squeezed his forehead between his fingers, his jaw clenching. Flashes of pain, remorse, and hesitation crossed his deep brown eyes. This was his son. No matter how many wives or concubines he had never elevated one above the other. How could he not know the kind of dirty schemes and backstabbing occurred in the imperial harem? He had tried his best to put an end to it all, but the pillar clans of his Tor kingdom were simply too conniving. While he wanted to destroy them all from the root, such a thing would cripple his kingdom as well. Now he was thrust into a situation where he was wrong no matter what he did. How could he ever look his son of his in the eye again? This matter concludes today. King Tor finally spoke, not looking up. No one will lay a hand on the fourth prince. The eyes of the ministers and censors widened. Your Majesty, silence. King Tor's roar shattered the floor beneath his feet, causing the mortals in front of him to bleed from their ears, unable to withstand his might. 7 years from now, King Tor continued solemnly, it will be revealed to the public that the fourth prince's meridian awakening ceremony has failed. He will live a simple life without cultivation. When the coronation games begin, He will not have the power or backing to succeed. His life or death will be up to his own luck. Should he survive, he will be allowed to live out the rest of his life in quiet. If I hear of him suffering even a single grievance, I will eradicate you and your families." King Tor's growl shook the scholarly ministers from head to toe. How could they withstand such killing intent? Should he die? King Tor did not finish his words. He turned his back to the ministers. Disappearing from the imperial court, it was seemed like just a single step. The back of Tor Palace was a wonderland of sorts. It did not have any heavenly treasures or overwhelming Kai density, but it did have a calm ambience that helped one to clear their minds. This place was the only area of the palace the king could come to be alone, as everyone else was barred from entry. That said, these truths were just by the standard of the shrine plane. To the higher mortal plane, this small garden was akin to heaven on earth. King Tor entered the Garden of Kings to stand beside a small stream of elevated water. This treasure was not too astounding, but it was definitely far better than a normal stream. It was charmed to have the capability of absorbing Kai from the air before releasing it slowly over time in the form of a comforting fragrance. The result of this was increased Kai density and purity in a given area. The king mindlessly stared at this stream, following its meandering and benign path of meaninglessness. It simply continued to do its job, absorbing Kai, storing Kai, releasing Kai, absorbing Kai, storing Kai, releasing Kai. In a lot of ways, it was a reflection of the pointless lives they led. Why did he become king? To protect the kingdom. Why does he protect the kingdom? To secure his family's future. Why does he want to secure his family's future? For the sake of the kingdom. So why did he sacrifice his son today? For the sake of the kingdom. But was not the sake of the kingdom supposed to protect his family? Shaking his head, King Tor walked to the end of the garden to an unassuming fountain. He gripped the edge of its gray stone with a sturdy hand. The small prick of something sharp cut his hand, but in the next moment, the gray fountain began to turn, revealing a dark staircase below. It would not be long before King Tor realized that what he thought was saving his kingdom had guaranteed its destruction. In the future, when he remembered that he made this decision because his son was born with a head of pure white hair and silver blue eyes, it was likely that he would not want to live anymore. 3 years later, Tor Palace had long since forgotten the oddity surrounding the fourth prince's birth. In fact, today was a true day of celebration. The first prince's meridian awakening ceremony was to take place. At this moment, a small boy not even a meter tall sat on a short stool, his little slender legs swinging back and forth. Behind him, Imperial Doula Miriam sat. Her actions were odd. She seemed to be applying some sort of dark pigment to the small boy's long white hair. Considering the toddler did not say much to these events, it was clear that he was used to it by now. Still, the oddities persisted. The little boy's eyes were closed. Even after several moments, they remained as such. One would have thought that he was taking a nap, but would someone who was asleep swing their legs in the way he was? "Little Ryu, you must be more careful," Imperial Doula Miriam chided. "After your elder brother awakens his meridians, at least until your own ceremony, you must try not to antagonize him, okay? If he's smart, he will stay very far from me, no matter what his cultivation is." The cold reply of the small boy was nothing like what one would expect from a toddler. Somehow, he had already gained the demeanor of an absolute expert, the kind that one would make certain to exterminate from the root after even the slightest offense for fear of one's own death. Imperial Doula Miriam sighed. "Just ignore his words. He's young and rash. There's no need for you to create a lifelong enmity between siblings over frivolous nothings. It's best to forgive and forget, to be magnanimous for the sake of your own health." One would never expect an adult to speak to a child in such a way. Imperial Doula Miriam described First Prince Amory as the 7-year-old child that he was, but pretended as though Ryu was not the 3-year-old toddler before her. She had begun subconsciously treating this boy as an equal for a very long time now. "Auntie Miriam, you are very naive," the small Ryu suddenly said. "Do you believe that first brother's animosity toward me is organic? Did I offend him in any way? Is he even old or mature enough to understand that he will have to compete with us, 3 younger brothers, for the throne? This first brother of mine has an aptitude that I understand well. He may very well be better than the average child, but his worldview is limited and shallow. The things he understands are not by virtue of himself, nor are his thoughts his own. If all of these things are true, then who do you think is responsible for molding him? Imperial doula Miriam shivered, but did not dare to reply. It was one thing for a prince to say such stinging words about another prince's upbringing, but for her to comment could result in execution. This was especially the case considering the person Ryu was alluding to was none other than the queen of their kingdom, Olivia Tor. Still, the scope of understanding this mere 3-year-old boy was astonishing. To understand the politics of the kingdom so clearly already, it was shocking to her even now. However, Ryu was right. No matter how Ryu reacted, Amory and his third brother would never reciprocate in good faith. Their minds had already been corrupted by their mother. Maybe only second brother deserved Ryu's hope for now, but who knows what would happen in the future. Of course, there was always a chance that his first and third brothers would break from the control of their mother in the future. However, that would not happen until they both matured and learned to distinguish right from wrong themselves. For now, it was impossible. With a deep sigh, Imperial doula Miriam stood to wash her hands in a bucket nearby. "All right, let's go take you to your mother. Be sure to stay quiet for mommy." "Okay." The beautiful first concubine Leilani smoothed her dress and hair, making final adjustments before taking Ryu's small hands in hers. "Also remember that you must stay respectful in front of your father. The future of the Agnes clan rests on your shoulders, so you must find favor with him, okay?" Little Ryu did not reply, simply following after his mother as they walked into a large ceremonial hall, outlined with beautiful glass artwork. Of course, he could see none of this due to the fact his eyes were closed. Although his vision was covered by darkness, he could feel the gazes that turned toward him and his mother. He remained unaffected, but many thought that this was due to his blindness. They probably believed he could not sense their emotions or understand their animosity simply because he was young and supposedly disabled. However, it would be more accurate to say that little Ryu was the sharpest person here. "First concubine greets Queen Tor," Leilani said with a light smile. "I'd like to be one of the first to congratulate you and little Amory. He has a very bright future ahead of him." Queen Tor greeted Leilani. "Thank you for your kind words. I would not like to get too far ahead of myself. There's a saying that expecting too much can end in devastation. Even if my little Amory fails, I hope that he can lead a calm and quiet life." Big sister Olivia's words are truly grand. "I hope to one day cultivate my own mental realm to be as broad-minded as your own." The light conversation between queen and concubine was the center of attention for most. There did not seem to be any out-of-bounds occurrences, but it felt uncomfortable to watch from the sidelines. Maybe it was because the entire time, 2 young boys stood to Queen Tor's back, one 7 years old, the other 4 years old, making faces of disdain and disgust toward the blind Ryu. Seeing the innocent boy with only a light smile on his face, completely oblivious to the torment of his elder brothers, made those of the royal court uncomfortable. The young boy's plight was quite pitiable. Still, that did not stop others from believing that this was how things should be. In fact, many believed that Ryu should be appreciative for even being alive, while others still believed he should still be killed. Introducing His Majesty, King Tor, a herald's voice shattered the building tension. Everyone present stood respectfully, including the formerly quiet second concubine Catalina and Ryu's second brother, second Prince Jedrek. King Tor did not seem to have aged even a single day. Still, his youthful exuberance did not stifle his commanding and oppressive aura. His sons looked up to him in awe. In their eyes, he was the greatest man in existence. They did not need to fake it, nor were these the teachings of their mothers. It was just how they felt. Being the son of the king was something they were proud of, and their expressions reflected this. This said, Ryu showed no particular reaction. The king continued to walk along the path laid for him, receiving the bows of everyone. With each step, Another column of individuals would lower their heads. The coordinated dance of decorum had a slight, unblemished beauty to it that was hard to describe. Whatever flaws he might have, it was clear that Tor was born to be a ruler. Soon, he had made his way to the head of the imperial court, receiving the slight bows of his queen and 2 concubines, along with his sons. It was at this moment that King Tor turned a sharp gaze toward his 4th son. Leilani tried to subtly nudge her son. She knew that if it was only under her insistence that he showed due deference, it would leave a poor impression. She could not help but silently scold her son in her mind, even if this was his first public event, and he was only 3 years old. He had been schooled in matters of decorum since birth. Unfortunately, Olivia and her sons would not be themselves if they were to miss such an opportunity. Amory scuttled over like a proud little soldier, his royal blue robes making him look quite dashing despite his young age. Much like his father, he had a strong head of brown hair and eyes, not to mention flawless bronzed skin. It was clear that he was well taken care of. He leaned over and whispered into his 4th brother's ear. "4th brother, father is before you now." In all fairness, his words really were soft. However, in a quiet hall specifically designed to project the voices of those who spoke at its head, such precautions were inconsequential. To Ryu, it was obvious that Amory had not planned this. The simple optics of him whispering to Ryu was enough to convey the necessary message. But that did not stop sycophant fools from relishing in the intelligence of the first prince, as well as his kindness. "Oh," Ryu responded with an embarrassed smile. "Hello, father." Ryu's response caused black lines to form on his mother's delicate forehead, even as some ministers nearly fell from their seats. Did this young man forget everything he was taught? What had he been doing for the last 3 years? First he had not bowed, then he called King Tor father instead of royal father, and even after his mistake was pointed out, he still did not bow. It was one thing for first Prince Amory to call him father in what should have been a whisper. Such a mistake could be forgiven, but to speak aloud in such a way was yet another breach of decorum. King Tor did not react much to Ryu's words, or rather, he did not get the chance to because first concubine Leilani had no choice but to take matters into her own hands. The miseducation of a prince was never the fault of a father, but rather was always on the mother's shoulders. After all, a king had too many other matters to attend to. At the very least, she had to make it clear that Ryu's actions were innocent mistakes and not the occurrences of her teachings. "Little Ryu, whenever you see your royal father in such a setting, you must bow, okay? It's okay to treat him as a normal father in private settings, but in public, he is a king." Ryu tilted his head to side, displaying his confusion. "But I cannot see, mother." The seemingly innocent words of the prince caused those who sat on the fence about such matters of the royal family to feel dull aches in their hearts. However, those who were already against his existence to begin with sneered in their hearts. How stupid did this child have to be to take such words literally? Even if he was only 3 years old, it was not too much to expect a higher level of education and subtlety. First concubine Leilani did her best to remain calm and continued explaining with a smile. "This mother of yours only meant those words figuratively. Simply put, in the presence of your royal father, showing proper respect is important." Ryu's small head nodded. "Ah, sorry, royal father, but I cannot bow to you out of respect." Leilani had almost released a breath of relief, but the end she choked on that very breath, unable to believe what she was hearing. The first prince and his full-blooded younger brother, Caden, almost could not hold back their laughter. Queen Tor remained completely silent, pulling her boys back from making fools of themselves all while. Second concubine Catalina had no particular reaction to the situation, aside from a raised eyebrow. Her son, however, seemed to be trying to take a nap on his feet, using his mother's hand for support. "Little Ryu." First concubine Leilani tried to teach her son once more, but this time she was the one who was interrupted. And why is that? Surprisingly, it was actually the king who spoke. His voice was filled with majesty and the smallest hint of curiosity. He really did want to know what this son of his would say. "It's simple, really," Ryu explained, unperturbed by his father's presence. "I'm blind. If I bowed, I have no way of knowing if I've done so in the proper direction. I could follow your voice, but if I miss by even a hair and grace a prince's bow to the wrong person, would not that be more catastrophic than not bowing at all? Is not my not bowing the highest form of respect I could give you, royal father?" A pin drop of silence filled the hall, stunned expressions coloring the faces of those present. This was the first public ceremony the fourth prince had attended. It could be said that Imperial doula Miriam and his mother were the only ones who interacted with him with any relative consistency. No one understood just what kind of prince he was. They had thought he was a fool, but did he just play them all? Was a 3-year-old making his dissatisfaction with the kingdom known in its imperial court of all places? Pa! The crisp sound of a slap not only made Ryu's ears ring, but also caused his face to sting with a deep and reverberating pain. Maybe it was due to the fact his eyes were closed, but he felt every moment the whooshing of the air, the vacuum that formed in his ear, even the shock of what happened were each multiplied many times over. He felt stuck in the moment, replaying the sensations in his mind again and again. Amory's Meridian Awakening ceremony had long since come to an end. In fact, the awkwardness of its start was washed over by the outstanding news related to his Meridian, skeletal, bloodline and spiritual foundation grades. However, it was clear that first concubine Leilani had not forgotten what happened. It had festered in her to the point where she hit her son for the first time in her life. "Do you not understand the gravity of what you've done today?" Leilani's shrill voice filled the mother and son's private courtyard. "Do you believe that you were very clever? Did you think that even if you meant your words with the utmost sincerity that it would matter?" Ryu did not respond. His face did not show the change in expression or borderline crying contortion a 3-year-old should have probably displayed. His eyes remained closed. His hands did not even clench into fists, and, aside from the gradual reddening of his left cheek, his features practically remained at their baseline. Even at 3 years old, Ryu had an arrogance that no one could shake. Today he could have bowed, but he did no such thing, since he was capable of beating up his elder brothers, something he had done on several occasions already. How could he not be capable of aiming a bow properly? He did not do it because he did not want to. According to their martial world's tradition, there was no shame in bowing to one's parents. In fact, it was dutiful and filial of a child to do so. The problem was that Ryu never saw King Tor as a father. He saw him as a weak and spineless man who did not deserve his respect. His brothers saw the king as the perfect and best man in the world. But to Ryu, if this was what the pinnacle of manhood was, the human race would have been extinct long ago. "Do you not understand that this is not just about you?" Leilani trembled at her son's lack of a reaction. She had half a mind to raise her hand and slap him again. Maybe this time the message would ring true to his mind. However, something told her that even if she skinned Ryu alive, it would make no difference to his demeanor whatsoever. The years passed slowly. On the 4th year since Ryu's birth, his second brother's Meridian Awakening ceremony took place. On the 5th, it was his third brother's turn. And finally, the 7th year came around, leaving just 3 days until Ryu's own. In these times, the kingdom was truly blessed. It seemed like all of the king's heirs were heavenly talents the likes of which their plane rarely saw. However, there was an undercurrent of competition that shook Tor Kingdom. It could be said that this generation of Tor heirs had no choice to be great. If they had been any less talented, the threat of the 6-pillar clans would have been too great to bear. Young geniuses sprang up not only in the royal family, but also Tor capital city's upper echelon. Not only were the princes heavenly talents, but so were the young masters of those 6 clans. Still, the third prince shockingly stood above them all, including his eldest full-blooded brother. He was actually born with an earth skeletal grade. The moment this news became public knowledge, the various elders of the heavenly body sect practically tore each other apart in competition to be his master. According to tradition, there were only 2 ways to enter the 4 sects of their plane. The first was to reach a certain cultivation threshold. No matter which sect was in question, This threshold was the spiritual severing realm. One would not be considered a true cultivator until this realm was reached. It was also those of this threshold that were no longer allowed to interfere in the matters of the secular world. The second method was actually far more difficult. This second path required one to be born as a heavenly and undeniable talent, being of the earth grade in one of the so-called foundations of cultivation, was the minimum requirement. In truth, King Tor was also born with an earth skeletal grade. In his youth, he had been taken away, but after all of his brothers crossed the age of 18, he came back to participate in the coronation games. After this, he was crowned as king and had ruled ever since. This said, once he stepped into the spiritual severing realm, he too would have to return to the sect after abdicating. For the Tor clan to have birthed not just one earth-grade genius, but 3 for consecutive generations of them, caused an uproar the other sects could no longer ignore. If it had just been the now abdicated Amel Tor, it was fine. Their sects also had one such talent each, but now adding Shuren Tor and his son, 3rd Prince Caden Tor, it was too much. On top of all of this, recent rumors had it that Amel Tor had just stepped into the half-step divine vessel realm. Even the sects of the immortal planes had started to show interest in recruiting him. Now the Tor clan had only become far more untouchable. It was in the midst of this shockingly good news that Ryu's own Meridian Awakening ceremony approached. Using the former King Amel Tor's cultivation increase as a pretext, Shuren Tor took his 4 sons with him on a trip, waving Leilani off and claiming that he could handle his own son's awakening ceremony. After all, even the poorest of families could arrange such a ceremony for their children. Although it often failed due to their poor talents, that did not mean that such unlucky clans did not still treat their newborn children as potential lottery tickets to a grander life. Ryu did not speak for the entirety of this trip. Even when he entered the heavenly body sect and met this shadow-like grandfather for the second time, he did not show much of a special reaction. When the day of his ceremony finally arrived, Ryu stood before his brothers, father and grandfather, a cold expression on his small, immature face, while his brothers, especially his first and third, stood nervous, each entirely certain that this 4th brother of theirs was the most talented of them all. Ryu somehow knew exactly what would happen. When his father pretended to pull a long face as the ceremony fizzled out, he did not so much as tremble. "To not even allow me a path to live. What a good father you are." Those were the only words Ryu spoke during the entire trip, and it earned him the second slap of his life. Like this, another 4 years came and went in the blink of an eye. The 3 eldest princes of the Tor royal family began to grow into their own, claiming milestones the likes of which few had ever seen. The first prince, although a far inferior martial talent in comparison to his full-blood younger brother, became a scholar of worthy note. At just 15 years old, he graduated from the 4 Kingdoms Institute with top honors and had already begun to take on large responsibilities in the Tor royal court. Many claimed that even if he did not gain great combat prowess, his charisma and steadily growing faction would be enough to make a mark during the coronation games. Still, this was just a matter of perspective. Even though the first prince was inferior to his 3rd brother, in comparison to the other young talents, even among all 4 kingdoms, he would not fall out of the top 20. The second prince was far more low-key than his elder brother. He seemed to have an inherent laziness to him that drove his mother, second concubine Catalina, crazy. That said, his love of money shone through with a fierceness. He seemed to believe that only when one was rich would they be able to recline as they pleased. Who cared about power? Power led to responsibility, which only led to more work. This philosophy ironically resulted in him working himself to the bone. But now, he had the financial matters of Tor Kingdom in his grasp. In fact, there were rumors that he had already infiltrated the economies of Opes, Lance and Viri Kingdom as well. Then there was the 3rd prince. Truth be told, of the 3, the general population knew the least about him. This could only be expected considering sects were barred from taking part in worldly affairs for the most part. However, there were still some cases where the curiosity of the public could be satisfied. Just 3 years ago, a beast horde ravaged the outer fringes of Tor Kingdom. It became clear very soon that the secular army did not have a chance against them. As such, the heavenly body sect had no choice but to dispatch a group of disciples in order to fulfill their responsibilities. After years of being hidden from the world, Third Prince Caden finally reappeared. He swept through the battlefield valiantly, bearing the crest of inner disciple with pride. At just 10 years old, the third prince had not only already become an 8th stage awakening realm expert, but he was actually capable of fighting second-order beasts already. One had to understand that beasts were more powerful than humans. A first-order beast was too much for a normal awakening realm expert to handle, while the second order was far out of reach. Yet the third prince shattered this notion completely. If this was all there was, it would be shocking enough yet. The third prince made a second appearance just 1 year ago during the sect gathering tournament. At just 12 years old, he placed top 20 against competitors double and sometimes triple his age. A 12-year-old pulse opening realm expert had actually been birthed to the Tor royal clan. As for the fourth prince, he had faded into the background. It was to the point where no one wasted their sneers or holier-than-thou words on him. He was simply a forgotten entity, one that maybe only a few individuals remembered the existence of. At this moment, this forgotten prince sat clad in black robes, his face expressionless and his eyes closed. There was an atmosphere of calm relaxation around him. A small girl who was at most 5 years old splashed her feet near a stream while a breathtaking woman who seemed like an older version of her danced freely as her cascading dark hair flowed in the wind. Fourth brother, tell me, is your big sister beautiful? Second Princess Isla spun in a mesmerizing yellow dress. Despite her childish demeanor, she was already a woman who had a child half as old as Ryu. That said, one would never assume so by her high-pitched whining. Second sister, how could I possibly answer that question? Ryu's lips slanted into a bitter smile. Your second sister believes you have the best eyes on this entire plane. Is that not enough? Isla took a seat beside her little brother, ruffling his black-dyed hair. Look at you, you are so handsome. Do not you want big sister to find you a little wife? In the corner of the courtyard, kneading away as God knows what, was Imperial Doula Miriam. She smiled at the second princess' adorable nature. It was rare that the two princesses came down from the heavenly body sect, but when they did, the aging doula felt gratified. Among those of Tor Palace, they were the only ones who actually acknowledged little Ryu's existence. One might wonder which of the two requirements the princesses of the Tor Kingdom met to be allowed to enter the sect. Well, the truth was neither. Instead, they actually both married experts of the sect, thus fulfilling the requirements for an unspoken third rule for allowed entry. Their husbands were quite powerful also, having both become outer elders of the sect at relatively young ages. Ryu smiled lightly. And which little girl would you sentence to become a widow? The second princess pouted, knocking Ryu on the head. Do not say such depressing things. Does this big sister of yours look like the type to allow you to die? Now be serious. The little girl of second brother's Garis clan is quite cute. She's only a year older than you, and this big sister's intuition tells her that she's taken a liking to you. There's also the Kunnel clan's young miss. She's already 5 years older than you, but that's okay. When you two get older and she gets droopy, big sister gives you permission to take a young and ripe concubine. Ryu did not know whether to laugh or cry. Were these really the kind of words a mother should say when her 5-year-old daughter was just a few meters away? The value system of this kingdom really was too backwards. Before Ryu could answer, the gate of his courtyard banged open, revealing the disheveled appearance of a beauty that lost out to the second princess in no way. In her arms, a small boy clung to her neck, clearly perturbed by his mother's erratic behavior. First sister, Ryu and Isla spoke simultaneously. First Princess Dahlia did her best to catch her breath, taking in a deep gulp of air before speaking. The natural order sect has been destroyed. Ryu's forehead wrinkled as he allowed his first sister's words to sink in. But even after a few moments, even the premise was difficult to accept. In the martial world, There were 6 planes, 3 mortal and 3 immortal. The plane the Tor kingdom resided on might be mortal, but it was the highest of the 3 mortal planes. This meant that among mortal cultivators, the experts of the natural order sect were the very best. Simply put, no one on this plane had the power to destroy them, especially not so quickly that information of an attack would not be disseminated before information of its destruction was. This meant one thing, and one thing only. Whoever destroyed this sect did it so swiftly that not even a call for help could be levied. The second princess showed a rare serious expression, while Imperial doula Miriam's frail, old hands trembled. Ryu's little niece did not seem to understand the gravity of the information, so she only continued to play. But it was clear that her demeanor did not speak for everyone. The first princess released her son, allowing the 2 little cousins to play with one another, as a tight frown took over her beautiful features. Who could have done this? Isla finally asked. How could Dahlia have an answer? The only reason she knew this information was because their husbands had sent a messenger beast. In the letter, they all but commanded their 2 wives to not travel back to the sect at this time, in case whoever was responsible was still at large. The truth was that if the natural order sect could not survive, Tor Kingdom had no chance, but it was at least safer than being alone on the road. It was likely an immortal plane expert. The casual, nonchalant voice shattered the tense atmosphere. After he finished speaking, Ryu had already gone back to meditating, as though his words needed no more explanation. Suddenly, a twist at his ear snapped him out of focus. Do not leave your big sisters hanging. Do you want me to teach you a lesson, little brat? Okay. Ryu rubbed his ear full of grievances. One of his sisters was a toddler in a woman's body, while the other was still a school bully. When would they ever grow up? There's not much explanation needed. The mortal plane does not have experts capable of taking out a sect, even if the 3 remaining sects joined forces against one. Although the one would surely be defeated, it would not end so quickly that news of an attack would not reach us. What about a beast horde? The second princess asked. Ryu shook his head again. That's even more unlikely. Even the so-called king beasts of this plane are only of the 4th or 5th order at most, while not even a 6th order beast could fulfill the task so cleanly and quietly. How can you be so sure? First Princess Dahlia could not help but asking. Although she loved this little brother of hers, he was a blind cripple who had not cultivated a day in his life. To top it off, the strength of individual sects was a closely guarded secret. No one, but they knew their limits. Their secrets are not so hard to see through, Ryu calmly explained. The 3 sects, or now, I guess 2, were both wary of your heavenly body sect because our Tor clan birthed 3 earth skeletal grade experts. This is public knowledge. Everyone knows it. Father is turning 63 soon, yet has not been taken away by the sect, which means he has not entered the spiritual severing realm. This is also public knowledge. Everyone knows it. Judging by that, we can say that earth-grade talents are rare. We can also judge their cultivation speed by using third brother, father, and grandfather as measures. If we factor in their lifespans, a good estimate is not impossible. Even if I overestimate, I'd still be correct. The 2 princesses and Imperial doula Miriam sighed. Why was it impossible for them to have one conversation with this little boy without being awed? Was he really trying to convince them that such closely guarded secrets were easily revealed simply by using public knowledge everyone should be aware of? Would not those old ancestors of the sect commit suicide if they understood this? Does not this mean that we are all doomed? The second princess said worriedly. If this matter was caused by the immortal plane, what chance do the rest of us have? Ryu remained silent for a moment. The truth was that the immortal plane would never get involved in conflicts of the mortal plane, as long as a certain balance was maintained. In fact, the current system of the mortal plane was put in place by immortal sects and clans in order to facilitate a greater flow of talents to their pool of experts. Many epochs ago, the mortal planes were awash with war and blood. In the beginning, the immortal plane ignored these matters as it had nothing to do with them. But soon even the immortal plane became embroiled in their own struggles. As a result, various immortal clans and sects began to seek out talent from lower planes. However, with them all dying so frequently, it was impossible to do so with any sort of efficiency. It was in response to this need that the immortal planes set out to reform the mortal plane. In the end, the 4-kingdom and 4-sect system was put in place. Each kingdom would be backed by a single sect, thus separating the matters of cultivators and mortals. Kingdoms would funnel resources to the sects by various means, while the sects would provide a baseline of protection. This system set a delicate balance, allowing sects and kingdoms to compete within their own lanes, but also controlling the level of bloodshed to acceptable levels. So it was obvious why, while his elder sisters worried over the potential attacks of this mysterious sect destroyer, Ryu was more worried about the impact the unbalancing of this system would cause. With its backer gone, what would happen to the Opes kingdom? How would the other kingdoms react? Would the now ancient laws still be followed? Eventually, Ryu shook his head, suddenly laughing. "Why are you laughing?" The first princess frowned, pulling on her little brother's already reddened ears. Ryu coughed lightly, pulling himself away. "I just had a funny thought. Would not it be amusing if the only reason the Natural Order sect was destroyed was because their name was too arrogant?" When the kingdom learned of the reasons surrounding the destruction of the Natural Order sect, the 3 women who had been with Ryu when he said those ill-fated words nearly died of shock. To think that even the words little Ryu said in jest could still be so bone-chillingly insightful. According to spies hidden with the Opes kingdom, the wreckage of the sect only included the destruction of their sect's entrance stone. It had stood for thousands of years, yet now it was nothing more than ash. Although normal humans could not cross the barrier to the sect, reports stated that the inner structures were completely untouched. However, dead bodies of experts filled the paved roads with blood and a terrible stench. Still, the ones who took this news the worst were the noble clans of Opes kingdom and the Opes royal clan themselves. To have lost their backer in such a way, and for such a frivolous reason, how heart-wrenching was that? The worst part was that, until their current king crossed into the spiritual severing realm, access to the sect and the treasures they left behind were completely barred to them. As a result of this, several greedy eyes trained toward the east, each with various thoughts of their own. However, there were too many barriers to satisfying this greed. For one, only those of the Opes clan and the descendants of the Natural Order sect knew how to breach the barrier to the sect. Secondly, even if they were able to pry such information out of King Opes, it would require war with the Opes kingdom. Thirdly, if one assumed that this war ended swiftly and did not raise the ire of the immortal plane experts who built their system of balance, how would the treasures of the Natural Order sect be split? For now peace was kept. The fear of breaking ancient rules set by the immortal plane clans and sects weighed heavily on their minds, wiping out whatever greed they might have had. That said, who knew how long such peace would last? Even in the face of danger, humans always found a way to justify their actions for the sake of wealth. Grandpa, 2 adorable 5-year-old children sprinted into the arms of King Tor, the little boy monopolizing his right arm, while the little girl took over his left. A rare smile graced the king's face, the likes of which had not been seen in public for decades. Behind the 2 children, Princess Isla and Dahlia walked into the king's study, neither of them surprised by this side of their father. Whenever it came to matters not pertaining to succession or the betterment of the kingdom, he left such kingly matters behind. Since their children would never be in line for the throne, King Tor had no reservations toward them. Okay, you 2 little mushrooms. Go off to the garden and play. Grandpa has something to speak with your mothers about. The 2 toddlers ran out without a worry in the world. Soon, with how powerful their fathers were, they'd be given their own awakening ceremonies and soar into the skies. The best resources of the mortal plane would be funneled into them, and they'd soon become pillars of the sect themselves. Even with how tumultuous the times had suddenly become, it was doubtful that they'd ever be affected. They deserved to be the envy of many. How are Adorjan and Kato, The king asked absent-mindedly, taking a seat. "Our husbands are doing well, father." First Princess Dahlia responded, a light smile on her face. At first, her and her younger sister had not been too excited to be married off into the sect, but their husbands were good men who treated them well. Just like there were clans to manage in Tor Kingdom, the Heavenly Body sect also had various clans that had grown over the years. The ancestors of such clans had once come from nothing, but due to their cultivation talent, were accepted into the fold by the upper echelons of the sect. Over time, they gave birth to their own factions that had grown to this point today. Back then, two princesses had no choice but to marry into these factions in order to consolidate the Tor clan's power in the sect. Of course, this was well before third Prince Caden's birth. If Caden had been born earlier, their sacrifice would not have been needed at all simply by virtue of his talent. With 3 Earth-grade experts, the Tor clan would be unshakable. That said, although this matter was slightly unfortunate, it could not be said that the two princesses were unhappy. That's good. Has the sect done anything special in response to the natural order sect's destruction? If you want to ask us how little Ryu thinks you should respond, then just be straightforward. Second Princess Isla responded. Her voice did not have any odd fluctuations to it. In fact, it sounded just as light and playful as it usually did. But the weight of her words was fairly clear. King Tor shrugged. If he can predict the reason for its destruction without ever taking a step outside, then his insight really is frightening. That's why us monitoring him is useless. If we waste even a single word trying to lead the conversation, he will realize it. The Agnes clan has already forever earned his bad side. Even his foolish mother is no exception. I do not know how you could expect us to help you. The first princess interjected. That's where you are wrong. King Tor shook his head. No matter how intelligent the fourth prince is, he is still only a child. Every child is the most susceptible to manipulation at this age, and not a single one is indifferent to living a life without warmth. His IQ is irrelevant to the matter at hand. You have not interacted with him much. Speaking with that child is like walking into a lion's den. Dahlia's eyes flashed with a complicated light. Why were they tasked with treating their little brother like an enemy? For years now, these two princesses would visit their fourth brother, only to bring news of their interactions to their father, who knew how many kingdom matters Ryu had unknowingly consulted on. While others assigned the rise of Tor Kingdom to his 3 elder brothers, these 3 here knew exactly who should be thanked. A boy who had not experienced a sliver of true familial love in his pitiful life. My asks of you two are simple. It's okay if he believes that I sabotaged his Meridian Awakening ceremony, but it is not okay that he confirms it or finds proof. You must also ensure that the Agnes clan cannot make a secret attempt of their own to redo the ceremony. The best case scenario is that he trusts you two enough to ask for help. In that case, you know what you must do, King Tor said softly. After a moment of complicated silence, the two sisters nodded. For the good of the kingdom, they had already sacrificed themselves. They did not find it odd for it to be their younger brother's turn. As his 2 elder sisters were meeting with his father, second concubine Leilani had traveled with her son to the Agnes clan. Unfortunately, this change in title was not a mistake. Within a kingdom's imperial harem, there was a hierarchy. However, this hierarchy was not decided by the order in which women married into the harem. Instead, they were decided by the importance of the woman to the royal clan. In her youth, Leilani had competed with Olivia for the title of queen. Unfortunately, she lost despite being the king's favorite due to the fact Olivia was simply more suited to be queen. Still, after entering the imperial harem, she had immediately been given the first concubine rank in acknowledgement of the king's affections. Alas, these matters were destined for change. After Ryu's Meridian Awakening ceremony failed, he immediately became the least suitable heir to the throne. Although Leilani still kept this rank for a time afterward, Ryu's lack of care for the matters of the kingdom caused the ministers to once more pressure their king into lowering Leilani's rank. The imperial censors stood at the forefront of this change, imploring King Tor to maintain proper traditions. The ranks of the imperial harem were highly important and could not be ignored. The royal marital household was to be held in the highest regard to the public. What would happen if the people began to ignore these hierarchical standings as well? Plus, the second prince was so outstanding. How would he feel if, despite his splendor, his mother continued to be ranked so low? Would he not grow a dislike of the kingdom and its ways? If this happened, would not there be inner turmoil within the royal clan? Under this pressure, King Tor relented once more, officially demoting Leilani to the second concubine title. As of now, the only concubine who ranked below her was third concubine Selene, a reclusive woman who happened to be the mother of their kingdom's two princesses. Due to a disease she contracted giving birth to Isla, she rarely appeared in public. It did not need to be said how much rage this induced within the Agnes clan. As a pillar family, ranked only below Queen Tor's Cedar clan, having their young miss be a first concubine, even of the royal clan, was insulting enough. But to now have her be demoted to the second rank, it caused an uproar within their upper echelons. Patriarch Agnes, an older man who happened to be Ryu's maternal grandfather, stormed into the imperial court to raise havoc. However, even after drowning the king and his ministers in a torrent of spittle and curses, nothing changed. This sort of failure led to the Agnes clan turning their pitchforks toward the mother-son duo. If Leilani had been more scheming and clever, she would have earned the title of queen and would not have to deal with this ranking nonsense, no matter how useless her son was. In that case, the face of the Agnes clan would be saved, and they would not have turned into the laughingstock of the six-pillar clans. Then there was Ryu. If he had not been born a cripple, or had, at the very least, been capable of awakening his meridians, this too would have never happened. What a useless pairing of mother and son they were, bringing not an ounce of good to the clan. If it was not for the fact they would incur even more sneers of disdain for it, they would have long since disowned the both of them. Still, Ryu and his mother were offspring of the Agnes clan, and, as such, had no choice but to return every year for their gathering. Currently, Ryu sat at the edge of a vast outer expanse, crossing his legs atop a gray stone in silent meditation. In the distance, many branch and main bloodline members of the Agnes clan younger generation horsed around. Some spoke amongst each other, some started friendly sparring sessions, while others introduced some of their close friends or love interests to one another. The clan gathering was held for reasons similar to why imperial censors existed. It was meant to instill a connection to the family and remind everyone, even branch members, that loyalty to the clan was of the utmost importance. It was for this reason that this gathering was mandated. "Ryu, is that you?" Suddenly, a sweet voice interrupted Ryu's calm state of mind. It was not that the voice stirred emotions within him, but rather he had not expected to hear this voice here. This was because it was the voice of the Garis clan young miss, and cousin to his second brother Jedrek. It was odd to meet someone of another pillar clan at an event like this one. Plus, her question itself was weird. "Yana, I did not expect to hear your voice here," Ryu said with a light smile. Yana blushed slightly at Ryu's words, feeling a light fluttering in her heart. She was only 12 years old this year, so she still had a lot of room to grow, but she had taken a liking to Ryu many years ago. It was at this moment that she felt gratified that Ryu was blind, so he could not see her in such an embarrassing state. "You remembered the sound of my voice. Yana is very happy," she said, her words almost dripping with honey. They had not seen or spoken to each other in more than a year now, so she had been prepared for the worst. But hearing that Ryu not only remembered the sound of her voice, but also her name made her happy beyond compare. Ryu almost chuckled. It seemed his second sister's intuition, when it came to the hearts of young girls, was fairly spot on. He did not know what he had done to gain this little girl's affections, but he seemed to have cast a shadow over her heart. Those around could almost see Yana's young maiden heart fluttering before them. Her fairy-like appearance had been the object of their hopes and dreams for several years already, but it seemed she had already found someone she liked. Clearly, they had not bothered to ask Ryu's opinion on the matter. None of them thought he was worthy of her to begin with. How could they fathom a reality where he would reject her? Still, technically speaking, since Patriarch Agnes only had one daughter and no other children, even if Ryu lost the coronation games, he could still become clan patriarch if he renounced all rights to the throne. So, among their generation, he was still the highest ranked no matter how much the upper echelon hated him. Simply put, if he was not worthy of her, then neither were they. The clan patriarch summons young Master Ryu to his study. Before Ryu could properly respond to Yana, a servant came to deliver a message. Yana felt saddened as she watched Ryu slowly follow the servant away, but there was nothing she could do about the matter. She was far too young to understand what love was, but she knew enough to know that she enjoyed being around Ryu. Was that not enough for now? As for Ryu, he had no such things on his mind. He was too mature to fall for someone like Yana. At the same time, he felt that her endeavors would only lead to her own heartbreak, something he cared little for. Of the young mistresses of this generation, Yana and the Kunnel family, Miss Ryu's second sister, mentioned were number 1 and 2. Simply put, they were almost guaranteed to marry into the royal clan as tools for their families. This was almost written in stone, considering the Garis and Kunnel families fairly low ranked among the 6 clans. While this sounded like good news for Yana, it was not. The top young maidens of a generation almost always married the king. Whether they became queen or concubine was the only matter up for questioning. This was exactly what happened with Ryu's mother, an Olivia of the Cedar clan. And obviously, as things stood now, Ryu would never become king. Truth be told, even if Ryu had the power to fight for kingship, he had no interest in the title, nor did he have interest in collecting beauties. He did not fully understand why, but every fairy-like lady he interacted with, no matter how beautiful or elegant, seemed plain and uninteresting. None of them were capable of moving his heart. It probably also did not help that he never actually laid eyes on them. He only listened to others describe how beautiful they were. He found the whole affair meaningless and uninteresting. Ryu silently followed servant, who continuously looked back with an expression of curiosity. The servant boy could not help but wonder how it was that Ryu followed him so easily. He suddenly thought of fantastical stories. He read about heavenly cultivators, capable of seeing an ant crawling along the grass from hundreds of yards away. But he immediately shook his head. Did not their young master fail to awaken his meridians? How could he be such an expert? Soon, the two of them had made their way to the Agnes clan's main house, a towering structure with ancient aesthetics and a tall set of wide stairs to its front door. It just so happened that, as they were making their way in, an escort of 5 was making their way out. Patriarch Garis, the servant boy bowed hurriedly. A bold elder gentleman walked ahead, sweeping a cold glance over the servant boy and Ryu, who followed behind him. Despite being his grandfather's age, Patriarch Garis only had a few streaks of gray in his reddish-brown beard. Plus, his valiant appearance was only helped by the fact he stood well over 6 feet tall. The servant boy looked toward Ryu nervously. He had purposely said this patriarch's name aloud to help out Ryu, so he could only panic when he saw that Ryu did not react appropriately. Ryu smiled lightly. Patriarch Garis, I hope you've enjoyed your stay at our Agnes clan. Forgive this blind young master for being unable to see you out. The brows of the 4 guards who followed the patriarch frowned. They were all middle-aged men of decent cultivation, so they knew ways of the world well. Although this young man's disposition was clearly quite good, he did not have the power to back up his arrogance. In the case that this was true, the best course of action was to lower one's head. The fact that this young master of the Agnes clan refused to do so would only ensure his demise. It was the epitome of stupidity. Patriarch Garis snorted in disdain. My granddaughter will not be marrying a cripple like you, no matter how many heirs you put on. Do tell your useless grandfather that. With a wave of his robes, Patriarch Garis turned to leave. As the retired general that he was, it was not much of a surprise that his personality was so abrasive. "Oh, is that so? Do tell her that I wish her the best then," Ryu said without care. Where did these people get off? Did everyone assume that Yana falling for him was his own blessing? Did they really never consider the idea of him not wanting her love to begin with? What did you just say? The former general's temper flared. It was one thing for his granddaughter to reject Ryu, but the words this young man just said made it sound as though it was the opposite. Had his ears heard incorrectly? Ryu did not seem to be listening. Instead, he had patted the servant boy's shoulder. "Do remember, Brother Parios, within the Agnes clan, even pigs and chickens must have their own pride. If I find that you've bowed to another person, not of the Agnes clan, I will be forced to punish you." A cold sweat dripped down Parios' forehead and back. On one hand, his heart warmed that their clan's young master remembered his name and even called him brother. But on the other, he could not help but steal glances toward the 5 valiant men who had stopped in their tracks at Ryu's words. He started praying to the gods above. "Please save me, O sky gods. I've lived a good life. Other than 1 or 2 trips to the local brothels, I swear I've committed no other wrongs. I do not deserve to die so young." However, Ryu did not sense his plight. In fact, he had already continued up the stairs, passing by the general as though there was not a murderous rage locked onto his body. Before any could even realize what had happened, he had already made it to the top of the stairs without incident and was headed toward the doors. Before he entered, he paused once more. "I have to say, Commander General Garis, I'm quite disappointed. The fact you allow me to reach the top of these stairs could only mean that you've dulled in your old age." Ryu's words were like a resounding slap to the face of the 5-man escort team. Were not they just thinking about how misplaced Ryu's arrogance was? Were not they just thinking about how he did not have the power to back it? Yet he was blatantly disrespectful to their clan patriarch, and they had not dared to retaliate. Was not this the clearest form of contradiction? Parios scurried up the stairs, almost falling to all fours multiple times before he finally dived through the large double doors to duck behind his knees and hands as though an explosion was coming. By the time he came to, not only had Ryu disappeared, but the Garis clan escort had left in defeat. The enraged roar of Patriarch Agnes shook the clan's main house. His cultivation could not compare to the king, but he was still a chi refinement realm expert. When he was angry, the trees swayed and ground shook. This was the way of the world. In the corner of his study, second concubine Leilani stood with her head lowered, unable to face her father's scrutinizing look. After holding in his anger until he was sure the Garis clan bastards were gone, old man Agnes could not control it any longer. "What did I do to deserve this? A useless daughter, a useless grandson. My entire main bloodline is filled with useless fools. Do I really have to hand the clan to my younger brothers?" By now, Leilani's good looks had begun to slowly fade. She was still an outstanding beauty due to her cultivation, but the war age waged was one it always took victory in. Coupling this with the stress she faced due to her own son's inability to help the clan, and the process only sped up. She was already 40 years old with nothing to show for it. All her life she had done nothing but lose. She was raised to become queen but had failed. She was then tasked with at least birthing the king's first son, but she had failed once more. Then her own son was finally born, and she thought it was finally her time to shine. Ryu was not only handsome, but a child with rare intelligence. But that had ended in failure once more. She could not help but feel that the entirety of her life was meaningless. Just now, her father had tried a last-ditch attempt to revitalize Ryu's potential usefulness to the clan. At the very least, if he could leverage the Yana girl's apparent affection for his useless grandson, the Agnes clan would gain the backing of a third of the kingdom's military. This would solidify their rank for at least one more generation, where hopefully a worthy successor would be born. However, it was clear how that attempt ended. Patriarch Garis had all but laughed in his face. The Garis clan was eyeing the queen position for themselves. How could they allow themselves to become tool of the Agnes clan? Why? Just so that they could remain ranked last, while the Agnes clan remained the second-ranked clan. What an absolute joke. The Garis clan men often devoted their lives to the military, It was for this reason that they were ranked so low to begin with. But after a series of events, the imperial censors had banned from being disseminated. The upper echelon of the Garis clan realized that the power they held was meaningless. If they wanted to avoid ever being disrespected again, they needed more power. Still, even if Patriarch Agnes understood the reason behind the rejection of the marriage proposal, how could he accept the reality of his clan's decline so easily? The clan patriarch was thoroughly enraged. What are you worth if not the hole between your legs? He turned his ire toward his daughter, swinging his palm toward Leilani, with barely a regard for her life. A resounding slap sent the second concubine crashing into a bookcase that leaned against the wall. Books flew into the air, flying upward only to land of Leilani's frail body as she slumped to the floor. Ryu's mother's face slightly deformed, her delicate cheeks swelling so quickly that her left eye sealed shut at a pace that was visible to the naked eye. It was at this moment that Ryu entered the study. Although his eyes were blind, he did not need them to know what had happened. He had heard everything from the yelling to the loud slap. Still, he did not show much of a reaction. "You summoned me." Ryu's cool voice directed a question toward his grandfather. Patriarch Agnes' brow twitched. He had half a mind to slap this grandson of his as well, but when he thought about what he had planned, he hesitated. He would need that handsome face to succeed. "You have one more opportunity to be useful to me." Patriarch Agnes responded coldly. "For the next 3 days, the Garis clan will be here. Although they can reject my offer of marriage, they cannot toss away old decorum. They must allow us to play host. During this time, the Garis clan young miss will likely cling to you as she always does. You must know." Ryu did not allow his grandfather to finish. In fact, his face has twisted into a look of sheer and unbridled disdain. "What did you say?" The chest of the old man rose and fell at astonishing rates. His skin reddened, and one could almost see billowing smoke coming from his now crimson ears. "I have no intention of making use of a little girl's affection to corner her future. In addition, Yana may be immature, but she is not stupid. She understands the value her body holds, which means the only way to succeed would be if I raped her. You really have the face to stand before your grandson and ask him to commit a crime to force the hand of the Garis clan." The fact that this was even an idea his grandfather was comfortable enough to say aloud filled Ryu with a deep disgust. If he was willing to say such things now, what other horrible things had he done in his life that Ryu had no idea about? What land of white bones was the Agnes clan's #2 ranking built upon? These thoughts caused a searing pain time to climb up from his stomach with such ferocity that Ryu almost vomited from where he stood. Without another word to his grandfather, who was currently pointing at him in mute anger, Ryu attempted to go and help his mother to her feet. But who would have known that he would be greeted with a piercing wind, headed directly to his gut? Before the blind Ryu could react, the small foot of a woman cracked 3 of his ribs, sending him flying to the opposite wall. The small foot of his own mother. "You useless, unfilial child. Do as your grandfather says." A shrill cry filled with desperation, rage, embarrassment, but most shocking of all, resolution, filled Ryu's ears. He coughed weakly, blood falling from his lips as he struggled to stand. In the end, a self-deprecating laughter left his lips. "I hope after I leave today," Ryu spoke softly, "that the Agnes clan disowns me completely. I never want anything to do with you all again." With nothing but a lonely back, Ryu walked out of the room. Ryu did not know how he had expected those matters to conclude, but what he did know was that it was far worse than he imagined. He had barely taken a single step out of his grandfather's study before he found himself flying backward after a hand grabbed the back of his collar. His grandfather's rage reached a fever pitch, causing him to punish Ryu by the strictest laws allowed by the clan texts. Ryu was stripped to his barest undergarments and dragged to the clan punishment grounds. With the sun burning high in the sky, the earth beneath his feet crunched with a coarse heat, burning the soles of his feet. His frail, ice-white skin took the brunt of the punishment, facing the beating streams of light without protection. Ironically, the only thing that protected him from a next day filled with red, painful blisters was the crimson blood that soon flowed from his wounds. The sound of a cracking whip violently tore through the ambience of the clan gathering. Confused expressions colored the faces of those attending, many of whom did not understand how to properly react to this abrupt change. Whenever there was punishment to be doled out, proper announcements would be made, and crimes would be listed off as a deterrence. But clearly, none of this had happened this time around. Crowds of Agnes clan main and branch members hurried to follow the source of the noise, putting down what they were doing for the sake of curiosity. However, none of them expected the sight they saw upon reaching the sand and dirt field of the punishment grounds. Ryu's small wrists were bound tightly by blood-soaked ropes, and then attached to a short pole before him. His bare knees were scraped by the earth beneath them, having been forced to kneel by the position of his tied hands. By now, his frail and delicate back was nowhere to be seen. Instead, its view was replaced by what looked like a fresh carcass, torn apart by the teeth of ravenous wolves. His face was partially covered by his black-dyed hair, sticking to his face due to some sick sweat and blood mixture. In the end, the only thing that left him the slightest bit of dignity was the pair of loose, now reddened underwear that could hardly cling to his skinny waist. Many gasped in the horror of what they were seeing. A hesitating servant brandished a thorn-laced beast tendon whip, too scared to swing once more, but even more scared of the glaring clan patriarch that stood to his side. In the end, his fear of killing Ryu was outweighed by what he feared Patriarch Agnes would do if he tried to back out of his duties. The whip continued to crack forward, snapping through the air with a ferocity that made those who witnessed every flesh and blood connection cringe. It was at that moment that the Garis clan entourage also made their way to the punishment grounds. How could the former general miss a chance to poke fun at the Agnes clan? He still had some built-up anger toward Patriarch Agnes for his negotiating tactics, but he was even more angered toward Ryu for so blatantly disrespecting him. At first, when he noticed that it was Ryu, he almost laughed. In fact, the four guards who always followed him and his granddaughter actually did. They found it hilarious that the kid, who was acting as though he had the whole world in his palm just minutes earlier, was essentially being spanked before the eyes of everyone. However, Patriarch Garis somehow did not find this scene funny at all. To his side, Yana nearly fainted in horror. If it was not for her grandfather's palm stopping her fall backward, the frail beauty would have collapsed entirely. The sounds of the cracking whip did not cease even as the crowd grew. Maybe it was only after 10 whips became 20, and 20 whips became 30, that those watching suddenly felt that something was off. What could a clan heir have possibly done to earn such a severe punishment? It simply did not make any sense, even for the worst crimes committed by those of the main branch. Things like thievery, or would only result in 10 lashes at the most. Of course, matters were different if you were of a branch family, but this was the young heir they were talking about. Plus, he was a young man that only came back to these ancestral grounds once a year for a week at most. Up to now, he had only been here for a few hours. What crime could he have possibly committed in this time frame? Tears fell like torrential rain from Yana's small face. Grandfather, help him. Her voice was drowned out by the sound of the cracking whip, but it was obvious what she wanted by how she tugged on her grandfather's sleeve. Patriarch Garis frowned. He came here to laugh, but it was not his place to interfere in the matters of another clan. Even if their trajectories were different, the Agnes clan was still far more powerful than his Garis clan, especially within the capital city. The truth was that even if Patriarch Agnes wanted to kill his grandson right before him, he'd still have no right to interfere. Still, it was clear that the old man had lost his mind. Even if Ryu's mother was an Agnes, Ryu's last name was still Tor. You could not simply whip a prince like this in public without facing consequences. What do you think would happen to the Cedar clan if they suddenly found out that first prince was punished by his mother's clan? All hell would break loose. At this thought, the former general hesitated. Would the royal clan really react the same way for this fourth prince of theirs, who would ostracize such a powerful clan for a useless prince? If it was a lesser clan, It could be justified to protect the prestige of the royal family. But the Agnes clan was no normal family. By the time the 50th crack resounded through the clan's land, even those who had been laughing began to feel their smiles freeze. Was not this too far? Come to think of it, they had not heard this boy make a single sound from beginning to end. Could it be that he was already dead? The mixture of sweat and blood dripped from Ryu's body. Eventually, the dye that coated his hair could not withstand the onslaught of tortured liquid, causing a dense blackness to join them. The darkness colored the ground beneath his lowered head, as his hair's true whiteness began to slowly shine through. Stop! It was only then that Patriarch Agnes called for the servant to stop. He did not do this to protect Ryu's dark secret, but rather did not want such a stain to attach itself to his Agnes clan. Toss him into the dungeon. When the former general heard these words, his frown deepened. You do not think this is too far, old man Agnes? A rage prickled the old patriarch's brow. It is not your place to question the matters of the Agnes clan. This roar was filled with such a deep anger that Patriarch Garrus said no more. There was simply no point. He had clearly already made up his mind. The servant stepped forward, untying the ropes from Ryu's wrist and being perfectly prepared to have no choice but to carry the young heir's body away. But before he could, a bloodied hand connected to a contorted wrist of blood, and mangled meat pushed his hand away. Under the astonished gazes of those present, Ryu slowly stood. His legs wobbled beneath him, nearly collapsing more times than they cared to count. But in the end, he raised up to his full height. An ugly bruise of purples, greens and blacks covered his chest, making it obvious at a glance that several of his ribs were broken. His back was so mangled that pieces of whole flesh fell from his exertion, leaving a path of meat chunks behind him. His lips formed a thin line, but his jaw somehow remained relaxed. His eyes remained closed, without a hint of tears or quivering. Even his steps were far steadier than they should have been. A deep pride and disdain for the world followed his slow pace. He did not sweep his head left or right. He simply followed a singular straight line. However, this straight line was not to the dungeon as his grandfather said. Instead, it was very clearly toward the outside of the clan. Where do you think you are going? Patriarch Agnes roared. Ryu's steps paused, pressing his thumb firmly against the side of his pointing finger. He caused his nail to protrude as far out as it would go. Without a hint of hesitation, he stabbed this thumb over his heart, drawing a cross upward, before crossing back once more to form a bloody X. There were no more words needed. The reddening, then subsequent blackening of Patriarch Agnes' face was all that was needed to understand the gravity of what Ryu had just done. In the martial world, there was no fiercer symbol than this bloody cross. It signified the cutting of ties to the deepest level. Without a look back, his steps continued forward, crossing a sea of spectators unable to withstand his steady steps. Still, his grandfather's rage reached a fever pitch. The eyes of those spectating could only widen as a sword appeared in his hand. You unfilial, die, you fool. The former general stepped forward, slapping old man Agnes' attack away. Do you even understand what it means now that he's cut off ties from the Agnes clan? He's solely a member of the Tor clan now. Do you think the imperial censors could allow you to trample on that truth? Before old man Agnes could even understand the gravity of his own actions, Ryu's back view had disappeared from the eyes of many. The events of today, it was impossible for them to remain hidden. Your Majesty, this has gone too far. The imperial court had once more descended into chaos. The last time it suffered such a tsunami of complaints was just after Ryu's birth. And now, ironically, just 11 years later, it was facing another dispute surrounding the very same young man. King Tor sat on his throne with yet another deep frown on his face. As much as he'd like to summon Ryu here to explain himself, the boy had slipped into a coma the moment he closed his courtyard door. He spoke to no one, he made no sounds, and in the end, it was just a few hours later that the news spread like wildfire. To think that not only had he cut off all ties to the Agnes clan, he had made his way back to the palace by walking the streets of the capital city. A matter that would have already been terrible became even worse by the news of a bloodied half-naked prince bleeding through the streets of Tor City. Should not you look into why the prince is in a coma before you start complaining about his actions? A minister who stood in a minority faction retorted. He and his colleagues had long been dissatisfied with the way the Tor imperial court functioned. The prince comes back to the palace half dead, and your first reaction is to scold him for cutting ties to the clan that likely did this to him. You naive fool. The other ministers pounced on this man like a fresh piece of meat. How many miles are there between the Agnes clan grounds and the royal palace? Over a dozen. You expect me to believe that a critically injured blind boy without an ounce of cultivation made his way such a distance alone? Imperial censor Orson sneered. This is obviously another temper tantrum being thrown by the fourth prince. He does not understand matters of importance and can only act like a selfish and petulant child. He'd rather see the Tor clan burn to the ground than face the fact he simply is not as good as his elder brothers. This matter of the Agnes clan was no joke. In fact, it was quite serious. This meeting was called immediately after everything was brought to light. What was the purpose of the king marrying the young mistresses of the pillar clans? Was the purpose not to solidify ties for future generations? If a prince unceremoniously cut off ties with the clan his mother had married into the royal clan to connect them with, then what was the point? Ryu's actions could cut off an entire generation's worth of carefully planned politics. Although they did not say the words aloud, many ministers could not help but look forward with an "I told you so" expression. If they had killed Ryu at birth, how could this mess have happened? Seeing his moment to shine, Imperial censor Briggs' round belly rippled, swooping in at the key moment once more. I believe that with these events, we are justified in accepting the proposal of the Lance and Veery kingdoms. Your Majesty, we've given the fourth prince enough leeway, and he's responded by slapping our faces. There's no need to stall the very first co-kingdom coronation game for his sake. Imperial censor Digby sighed, his old frame shaking, while a flash of killing intent emitted from Imperial censor Orson. A moment of silence washed over the court as they all looked toward the king. The king sat silently, his forehead practically glued to his hand as he stewed. Just days ago, news of the destruction of the Natural Order sect took the kingdoms by storm and was obviously not a matter that could be ignored. Although the various clans and sects were hesitating with the immortal plane in mind, everyone was very much aware of the fact everything was now working on a very fast timeline, one that was taking them all for a ride. When the kingdoms learned of the reason behind the Natural Order sect's destruction, they felt emboldened. Not only did this news likely mean that their other sects were not in danger, but it also proved that it was not their fault that the Or's kingdom lost their backer. With these reasonings in hand, the kingdoms felt justified in splitting the resources of the Natural Order sect among them. But there were a few problems that still lay in wait for them. For one, although they dared to split the resources of the Natural Order sect, they did not dare to do so while stepping outside the rules set by the immortal plane. Since the Natural Order sect had been destroyed, this meant that the matter of splitting their resources was entirely left to the secular world. This was because it was Or's kingdom, a secular world construct, that was defending this now abandoned land. Essentially, this meant that remaining sects could only have minimal involvement in the coming events. Secondly, they were on a timeline. King Ors was already very close to the spiritual severing realm. The moment he stepped into this realm, all of their planning would be for naught. As for the reason this was true, it was simple. If the resources of an entire sect were suddenly funneled into the secular world, not only would the three remaining sects be unallowed to retaliate, but the Or's royal clan would suddenly become far stronger than their respective kingdoms. Although it was true that even if this came to fruition, the Or's kingdom would never take the initiative to attack three enemies. It would be more than enough to hold them off until the sect could be rebuilt. Simply put, if King Ors succeeded, the Or's kingdom would gain great power while still following the rules imposed by the immortal plane. At the same time, the sects would be unallowed to interfere since Or's kingdom would still technically be part of the secular world. The only caveat would be the King Ors also would not be allowed to interfere directly. If these events occurred in this way, it could actually become a blessing for Or's kingdom. Thirdly, and maybe most importantly, if they wanted to band together to deal with Opeth's kingdom now, they had to minimize as much infighting among them as possible. The only way to do this was to decide a method of splitting their treasures without causing internal disputes. And this was where the co-kingdom coronation games came into play. According to the plan, the kingdoms would introduce their coronation games together, allowing all of their heirs to compete with one another. This would work out perfectly, since all of their heirs would be 18 long before King Or's was estimated to break through. Plus, with the competition that often occurred between these four kingdoms, this seemed like a logical next step. None of them believed the Or's kingdom would reject this chance either. This was because, after the natural order sect was destroyed, their fate took a massive hit. If nothing was done soon, they would begin experiencing terrible natural disasters in the coming years. However, if they did well during these games, then they'd be able to raise the confidence their citizens had in them and their future. The final step of this plan simply relied on the rankings. Simply put, they'd give the Opeth kingdom a lane for survival. If they placed first amongst them all, then their kingdoms would back off and never think of the natural order sect's resources. However, if they placed anywhere but first, the treasures would split 4 ways based on rankings. This way, a war did not even need to be fought. Still, there was only one problem. These events had to take place before King Opeth's breakthrough, or else it would all be meaningless. And unfortunately for Ryu, he was by far the youngest of the royal clan heirs. While all others would reach the 18-year-old threshold, little Ryu would not. When some ministers raised this issue, they were received with disdain. So what if the coronation games were supposed to happen when one turned 18? Did anyone here believe that Ryu would be able to improve enough to have any sort of mark with just an extra few years? Raising this point was laughable. After multiple rounds of debates, many pointed out that the third prince was only 2 years older than Ryu. Yet no one was worried about him. Clearly this was a matter of lackluster abilities and not youth. Why would you pity a young man born with everything who decided to do nothing with his life? Such an existence should not be allowed in the royal clan to begin with. Others still argued that the third prince was actually closer to 3 years older than Ryu, having been born slightly more than 2.5 years earlier than Ryu. If they went through with the timeline as it currently stood, Ryu would be by far the youngest at 15, while the third prince would have already crossed the appropriate 18-year-old boundary. But these arguments fell on deaf ears. By the end, King Tor managed to push off such talks until today, and obviously this now had an evident ending. Finally, King Tor spoke solemnly. "Tell the kingdoms that we accept their proposal. 4 years from now, the first co-kingdom coronation games will take place. It's best to not tell the fourth prince about this in order to avoid any more mishaps. Write it into law if you have to." With those words left lingering in the air, the king turned and left. While his death date was being decided, Ryu had slipped into what would become a coma of several months. By the time he awoke, he would find only Imperial doula Miriam by his side. The old doula was so excited when Ryu's eyes finally fluttered open that she almost threw a small party for the two of them. It was only under Ryu's insistence that she gave up on the idea. Still, Ryu felt a comforting warmth. Maybe others would be hurt by this reality, but at least in the endless cold he faced, there was at least someone who was by his side. Imperial doula Miriam slowly helped Ryu sit up. Slowly. "You've been asleep for so long that you are definitely suffering from more than a few bed sores. Also, your muscles have significantly weakened. It's okay to rely on this old lady. I might look frail, but I'm still a pulse-opening realm expert." Ryu coughed slightly under the strain, but still managed a small smile. "Are not there babies out there who need your help far more than me? I'm retired. This old lady can spend her time as she pleases." She spoke dismissively, raising a cup of water to Ryu's dry lips. She had tried to keep him hydrated during his coma, but it was extremely difficult. In the end, she had no choice but to sustain his life with her own energy. She felt gratified that she had given her life to the medical field. Taking Ryu's weak body into her arms, she carried him into the bathhouse, meticulously stripping away his dirtied clothes. Ryu did not seem too embarrassed by this prospect, as he had long since treated the old doula as his grandmother. Plus, if he did not receive this help, he did not believe that he could do it alone. Imperial doula Miriam sighed when she saw the sight of Ryu's bare back. His spine protruded outward along with his ribs, and his skin had become so sickly that thin veins of blue and green were clearly visible. But by far the worst part was the visage of terrible scars that ran across his shoulders and back like the trenches of a muddy battlefield. "Is it that bad?" Ryu said through a pained chuckle. How could a mortal body not scar in the face of such torture? Ryu had already expected as much. "It's bad, but it is not the end of the world. A man with battle scars is the dream of any woman." Having learned that lying to her little Ryu would accomplish nothing, she used a different tactic. "Maybe if the scars were earned on the battlefield," Ryu said softly. "I'm not sure if there's a market for men who gained scars being beaten by their own grandfather and mother." A pained expression colored the old doula's face as she brought a warm, moist toilet to Ryu's back to begin wiping the accumulated dirt and grime from him. Although a sort of phantom pain overwhelming Ryu, as he felt each bump of every one of his scars, he bit the inside of his lip to stop himself from crying out. Maybe in the face of his pride, keeping silent was easier for him, but he had always been the most vulnerable around Miriam. "Would you like to listen to a story?" Imperial doula Miriam asked. The truth was that Ryu had been banned from the royal library ever since he was old enough to read. Of course, this did not make too much of a difference considering he was blind, but there were many sections of the library he was still unallowed to send his own servants to. In the end, much of his entertainment came from the old doula telling him stories. Truth be told, it was because of Miriam that Ryu was able to gain a scope of what the world held. He learned about concepts he had never experienced himself, broadening his horizons to new heights. Maybe the only thing the old doula had never told him was just why he was ostracized by his family. Still, Ryu was intelligent. Was he really born blind? Why did he have such vivid memories about what things looked like then? Plus, why was it that his hair was forcibly dyed every day? Why was it that his third brother had called his mother a whore back then? Anyone with half a mind could begin to piece together the meaning behind all of these things. Even without knowing the true story, Ryu's guess was not too far from the reality. It was a truth he found hilarious if not utterly enraging, but it was somehow his truth nonetheless. "How about I tell you a story instead?" Ryu smiled. "Where did you come by this story?" Miriam said with a surprised expression. Ryu looked off into the distance. While he was in his coma, he had had a dream so vivid that it almost seemed real to him. But when he awoke, he was slapped with reality. How could such a perfect life be his own? What a joke. But he felt that if he did not speak this dream aloud, it would disappear from his mind forever. If that happened, Ryu did not know if he'd survive. Although he had not broken down yet, he was akin to a tattered feather blowing in the wind, still unable to grasp his own future. "Let's just say it was a dream of mine," Ryu said lightly. "Oh, the old lady is listening. On the highest plane of all of existence, there exists a mountain so tall that even the clouds can only hug its feet. 3 moons shine among the stars at night, and 3 suns blaze in the morning air. Within this highest plane, there was a family that stood above the rest. The father could shatter the earth was a single step. The mother was gentle beyond compare, lighting the world with her beauty and smile. The grandmothers were phoenixes who soared through the skies, protecting their family with a feverish might. And the grandfathers could pierce the clouds with a single roar. To this family, a child was born. Although he was weak and frail, he was cherished like a treasure. In return, he blessed this family too. They rose to a greater height together, relying on one another as a family should. Hundreds of years into this child's life, he met a valiant woman who understood how to fight for her own freedom. She stood before him and demanded his love not only for her sake, but for his as well. Over time, these two fell in love. She blossomed into a great expert, while he learned to fight for his own freedoms. They were a star-crossed story that should have never come together, yet they formed a bond unbreakable even through lives. Unfortunately, even this heartfelt story had its own ups and downs. The greed of those on the outside caused jealousy to be aimed toward this family. In the end, the child was forced into a corner, where he was forced into making a decision he labored over. In the end, for the sake of his family, the child took his own life, leaving behind a promise to his beloved. Imperial doula Miriam wiped her cheeks with a free hand. How could she not sense the longing in little Ryu's words? "Call me Granny Miriam from now on, okay?" Soon, time began to crawl forward once more. Drying the tears, Imperial doula Miriam cried over Ryu's story. Neither knew the ending to the story, but they both wordlessly accepted its importance. Over the next few months, Ryu never left his courtyard. Although this was completely by choice, it was likely that even if he had wanted to, he could not have. The situation with the Agnes clan eventually became a story of old, but the consequence resulted in Leilani being demoted once more to the role of third concubine. It was no surprise that Patriarch Agnes threw yet another fit over this matter as well. Everyone knew that the former third concubine Selene and mother of both princesses would be bedridden for the rest of her life, yet Leilani had been relegated beneath her. To make matters worse, Leilani had birthed the king a son. Within the martial world, and especially within ruling kingdoms, the value of a son far outweighed that of daughters. The act of demoting Leilani was not only a slap to her face, but a resounding one to Ryu's as well. If he cared, that is. During this time, Ryu was in a world of his own. To those on the outside, looking in, he seemed to have given up on life entirely. He hardly spoke. He would spend days on end meditating without pause, and he even seemed to reject any modicum of love that was not from Imperial doula Miriam. Of course, his elder sisters visited him every few months when they could, but these visits grew further apart as their children grew. Ryu's little niece and nephew, of course, went through their own awakening ceremonies, and since this was such an important time for their growth, they could no longer leave the sect as they willed. Although they were not born with earth-grade talents, they both had black skeletal grades, making them far more talented than the average cultivator. In a few decades, they would soon become backbones of the heavenly body sect. As for Ryu, his days were simple. He would eat, listen to Granny Miriam's stories, and meditate. He had lived a life of darkness until now, and at first it had been a source of pain. But now, it was an escape. Ryu felt that the longer and more fiercely he meditated, the more real those visions of his dream became. That huge mountain, that familial piety, that first true love at all, almost in tragic humor, felt like his. All of these images made Ryu's own life seem like nothing more than a joke. Could his family even be called one? He suddenly felt that it made sense his heart had never been swayed by the women here. How could any of them compare to even a tenth of his pink-haired goddess? But the reality was that Ryu was awake now. When his eyes opened, his heart shattered into pieces he still had not found even now. He had never felt such a fierce pain in his life. Not when his mother hurt him, not when his father abandoned him, not even when he was whipped before hundreds of spectators. That heart-wrenching, soul-tearing pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Him staying indoors became about more than escaping the sneering voices on the outside. It was about settling within an environment he himself could control. Maybe if he thought hard enough, maybe if he meditated and reached a deep enough state, he could forever sink into that reality and make it his own. He did not know what kept him going, but a small voice in that back of his mind kept telling him that this was his last chance to make something great of himself. Ryu could not help but laugh at the voice. Even in his fanciful dream, the man who had everything still could not fight against fate. He ended up attempting a second awakening only to die, just like millions who had tried before him. If even that lofty figure failed a man who was capable of far more than him, then what chance did he have? Still, Ryu kept going. What else could he do? In truth, He still aspired to be like the man in his dream. Although the man failed, he was still brave enough to fight against his circumstances, something that Ryu himself could not boast. Even so, Ryu decided to do what he could. Through meditation, Ryu's mental realm unknowingly grew stronger, and the memories of his dream grew more vivid. His daily meditation, something he had been doing since he was a toddler, suddenly became the sweetest part of his life. It was only during those sessions that he could relive that Ryu's life, to feel as he did, to love as he did, to smile as he did. In truth, even Ryu did not know what path he was headed down. He could only piece things together from what he had heard. One's mental realm was not just about seeking out energy like other paths of cultivation. In fact, Ryu did not even know what spiritual chi was at this point. All he knew was that those around him often used the concept of mental realms and mental fortitude interchangeably. He could still remember his mother mentioning wanting to cultivate her mental realm to the point of Queen Tor's back, when he was just 3 years old. Then she had not been referring to energy. She had just meant a state of mind. These ideas were not much, but it was what little Ryu grasped a hold of. He began to steadily grow his patience, learning to clear his mind for longer and longer periods of time. He had no purpose in mind other to sink deeper into that dream of his. What Ryu did not know at this point was that all the hardship he had faced in the life was steadily building a path towards something great, gradually refining and tempering his mental realm. Whether he would be able to grasp this opportunity would be entirely left to him. As Ryu meditated as he had done all his life, the 4 kingdoms and their citizens were moving around excitedly. The first ever co-kingdom coronation game had been announced, and the banners of national pride had never been risen with such ferocity and passion. Everyone from the poorest to richest man animatedly discussed the odds of victory. Soon, profiteers opened gambling establishments, accepting bets even though the event was several more years away. However, this was when an old woman the king had not accounted for caught wind of the news, or rather, he had. But he had not accounted for her willingness to risk her life for a child that was not her own.